Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank the Massachusetts Gaming Commission and all of you for attending this afternoon's session and today's really landmark event, the way I see it. It's my privilege today to introduce to you this afternoon's panel. It's composed of a number of experts in their respective fields. Mark Van der Linden has done a really outstanding job in bringing this crew together. With today's discussion, we're still working on these slides, so I'm going to extend my introductions a little longer than I thought I was going to. We're going to be talking about 10 topics related to the development of responsible gaming strategies and tactics. And our format today provides for an introduction of each of these topics by our panelists. Now, this is going to be challenging in that each one of these panelists can really write a novel and provide a whole course load of materials on their respective topics. But instead of getting a course load of content, we're going to be restricting their comments to about 12 minutes on the timer and then 15 minutes per topic area, allowing for a few minutes from the other panelists whose wealth of information extends beyond the topic that they're immediately introducing. So with our format, we'll be going kind of down the line. I won't be providing much in the way of introducing the panelists regarding their background and expertise. I can tell you that they are all very distinguished, and I will invite them to provide any information about their background as part of their 12 minutes. I am going to, because we're starting a little late and our time is so short, I just want to go ahead and begin this first presentation, which is on the providing a larger kind of framework for the panel. Now, the panelists were asked to talk about components of a responsible gambling strategy or tactics. And it's important to understand that these tactics or components are part of a much broader responsible gambling strategy. This morning we heard different perspectives, and I thought it was very interesting and very useful to hear our morning speakers as they presented kind of different concepts of responsible gambling in different ways. For instance, Dr. Schaefer talked about responsible gambling from a much broader perspective, talking about how it fits within a broader public health approach, as well as other models can be applied. We also heard about responsible gambling. Keith was talking about it from a national perspective of how what occurs here in Massachusetts could have national ramifications. And we heard from the AGA talk about the industry's perspective on responsible gaming. One of the things that's important, I think, for us to understand today is the objectives of our meeting and its ultimate goal, and that is to assist the Massachusetts Gaming Commission develop responsible gambling strategies, frameworks, rules, and regulations. So really the universe that we're talking about today is much more limited than we heard this morning. It is responsible gambling from the perspective of a regulator and how that's going to fit within Massachusetts only to those casinos and slot parlors that are under the regulatory jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. So although today's topic may seem very kind of focused on the operator, it's necessarily focused so because that's the area of influence that the Massachusetts Gaming Commission has. When we look at responsible gambling frameworks from an international perspective, we could see that they've been developed by two different kind of bodies. One are trade associations, and the other well, there's actually three bodies. One is an academic community, and the Reno model is a great example of that. And the Reno model is a great model, however, it's very broad. And so it has certain applications to how regulation is determined. However, it's really a much broader model. It speaks much more broadly to how, as a broader community, we can address this topic. Now, so there's this kind of academic body of research. There's structures that have been developed by trade associations. You heard about the American Gaming Associations. There's others as well. There's the European Lottery Association. There's the World Lottery Association. They've also developed responsible gambling frameworks. And it's interesting to look at the frameworks that they've developed, because when we do look at them, we can understand just how those frameworks fit the environment that they were born from and that they are applicable to. And it's clear when we look at other frameworks that they don't all transfer to other jurisdictions in their entirety, because they are so specific to the environment that they were born from. The other area, oh, we're up and running. Let's see. Now I can actually, do we have a clicker? No.
You're good. The big button.
No.
I'm your clicker. Okay. So these are the trade associations I spoke of, and go ahead. Forward. And this is just an example of the World Lottery Association, the way that they put together their framework. They have 10 program components within their larger framework, and as you see from looking at those components, they mirror some of the components that we'll be hearing more about this afternoon. Now, from the governmental responsible gaming kind of codes of practice, there's examples out there from the international community. The Australian Government Productivity Commission has put forth a set of recommendations, not the entire, the framework hasn't been universally applied within Australia. However, they did, I think, a nice job laying out the strategies and the tactics. There's also the Queensland Responsible Gaming Code of Practice. That one isn't an enforceable code. And then what the UK has done with their gaming commission has taken a bit of a different tactic and embedded responsible gambling into the regulations that one would normally see within a code of regulations around gaming. And go ahead and advance. This is the Australian Productivity Commission's their policy trilogy. And as you see here, they have 3 strategies. And underneath the strategies, they have a number of tactics. In fact, this may be even more defined than a particular tactic. It goes into great detail regarding the specifics of the approach. And next. And the Queensland Responsible Gaming Code of Practice. And I'm just showing you these to give you an idea of the different structures that other governmental regulatory bodies have laid out. Here you see that their practices are categorized under these 6 different strategies. And next. And the UK Gaming Commission, one of the, in which you see their principle is keeping gambling fair and safe for all. Now, when we talk about values, I think they laid out their value there, and their strategies and their tactics follow. You have that here in Massachusetts. In fact, if you look on your agenda, it opens up with the mission statement of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. And within that mission statement, it lays out, I think, very nicely what are the values, and not only the values, but really what is the what's your kind of authorizing language to move forward as you develop your regulations. So you do have a nice base work to work from, such as what they did here in the UK. And with that, I am going to, I don't even know if we have, maybe if any panelists want to throw in any comments to broader. Okay, then let's go ahead. We're a little bit behind schedule already. And so I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Natasha.
The chairs are glued down. Okay, so I diverged only slightly from what was asked of me by Mark, which is to talk about the regulative adjustments that could potentially be made to the technological design features of gambling machines, because I think it's important to situate that approach and those kinds of interventions and adjustments in the larger framework of regulative approaches. Different regulatory approaches imply different models of accountability, and I think I'm clicking here as if I can click, because I'm imagining this my computer click. Great. So these are the kinds of questions that arise when you consider different models of accountability and different approaches to mitigating the harms of problem gambling. Specifically in the case of gambling machines, which is I'm talking about today not just because that's my area of expertise, but because it's currently associated, this form of gambling, with the highest problem gambling rates in Western countries. So I think it's instructive to focus here. So when it comes to this question of how policy might mitigate problem gambling, here are the different answers to this question of who or what is in control in the machine gambling encounter, who or what should be held accountable for loss of control, the gambler, the industry and its products, their interaction perhaps, which should be regulated and how. Click. So there's a kind of what I think of as an accountability spectrum running from individual to the industry. And in a sense, all of these different, I wasn't here this morning, but I imagine we've already been talking about different approaches and interventions fall in different places along this continuum. So if I could have the first. So you could say that the most, at the end of the spectrum of the individual is this idea that gambling is a free choice, it's straightforward, and this would imply a kind of intervention that's sort of purely self-regulation, that's what's called for. In its extreme form, the idea is the market should be free and unregulated, and individuals should fend for and be responsible for themselves. A somewhat more moderate version of this logic is the idea that rational behavior is a function of informed choice. In other words, the capacity to be responsible depends on full information, and accordingly, consumer education would be the intervention suggested here. And this would leave machine features and functions intact and use instead signs, displays, and pamphlets to educate gamblers. The idea here being the aim is to help gamblers be good shoppers. So it fits a kind of consumer, that approach to consumer protection. Just one example of this. Here's an ad from next click. Sponsored by the American Gaming Association and one of its responsible gaming campaigns. So you see a gentleman who's sort of taking it on himself to manage himself. He says, without setting limits, it's easy to get carried away. There's many other examples that I could put up there. So next slide, we have this relatively new idea of pre-commitment, which is a very exciting idea. To my mind, it clusters with these other individual-oriented solutions in the sense, and you'll hear more about this, I imagine, a few talks down the line here. This involves individuals pre-setting limits on time, frequency, or money spent gambling prior to starting to play. So this is a kind of self-accounting software. I've heard it described by designers of such software as a control aid or a personal navigator, which helps the gambler, quote unquote, enact responsibility. Next slide. I just wanted to show a couple of images. These are out of date, but I thought they were interesting because this is one of the very first, if not the very first iteration of a comprehensive pre-commitment kind of software program by TechLink in Canada. I won't go into the details of this. I just wanted to show the way the focus is on the person. It's sort of a personal banking scheme where it's my account, my money limits. You are regulating yourself. And just another example, which Mark actually brought to my attention, this relatively new PlayScan software. This is a more recent iteration, which even features things, you can't see it from there, like self-assessment tools to evaluate and even diagnose yourself and whether you might be gambling in problematic ways. Next. Okay, and finally, click. Actually stay, no clicking yet. I just wanted to note that pre-commitment is, some have noted, it's a promising strategy for mitigating harms, but that the parameters with which it's been implemented so far often make it quite ineffectual, and this has to do with policymakers who are eager to embrace something like this, but very reluctant to inconvenience non-problem gamblers or to adversely affect revenues. So it's just a difficulty. You know, there's pre-commitment and then there's pre-commitment. There's many ways in which you can implement it. Will it be fully voluntary? Will it be fully mandatory? Somewhere in between? Will all casinos be linked together? Many details there that, again, I'm not going to get into. With regard to where we're at now at this accountability spectrum, so far the product has been left pretty much totally intact, and all the energy is focused on the person and helping her to regulate herself better through the kind of self-management. I don't think that's just to be upfront, a bad thing. I think that's great, but I think it has to come also with some awareness of the fact that this is a person and product encounter, and that it's also important to regulate the product through parameter modifications to minimize harm. I will not stand here and pretend that I know which parameters should be modified, but it is not the case that there's no evidence. This is not more research. Certainly more research needs to be done, but not at the cost of pressing pause on any kind of implementation of what could be called a technological design modification, because there is evidence out there, quite compelling evidence that certain things do work and that others don't. So given my own work, click on the design of slot machines, it's the last of these that Mark really wanted me to focus on. So in the remainder of my minutes, I'll just take you on a whirlwind tour just to get these things out there on the table as part of this conversation about regulation opportunities here in Massachusetts. This whirlwind review of the different ways design features have been regulated, or that gaming jurisdictions have proposed to regulate them. And then I'll wrap up by highlighting a few of the measures that have actually proven themselves worthy of implementation that I think should be seriously considered by the Commission. So time is, I've sort of organized these loosely under 3 categories. Time is a very important kind of intervention site. So here are just some interventions that have either been suggested or implemented at different jurisdictions around the world. Displaying a permanent on-screen digital clock. I should have put a digital clock up there, right? I went analog. Mandating timeouts at certain intervals. Mandatory cash outs at whatever minutes of continuous play, allowing following a 5 or 10 minute warning. Slowing down the rate of reel spin, and there's lots of discussion in this in the 2010 Australian Productivity Commission report and the earlier 1999 one. Pausing the reels between spins and increasing the time interval between bet and outcome. And just to focus on one of these for a second, some countries mandate a minimum time gap between games. One country, for example, Belgium, it's 3 seconds. Spain is 5 seconds. South Australia, it's 2.1 seconds. It's really specific. You can just imagine the policy conversations there to arrive at that number. And 3 seconds in Tasmania and Queensland. And Bob has done a lot of work in this area, so we could speak to it in the discussion. Okay, next slide. Money. So another focus, obviously, is on machine features that play a role in the monetary transaction, which is considered a big part of problem gambling. I should say that removing ATMs from casinos or at least imposing withdrawal limits on ATMs is something that's been shown to be highly effective. That doesn't directly concern the gambling machine itself. So I'm going to focus on those. So one would be decrease maximum bet size. Some point to Europe, where there are far lower rates typically than in places like Australia and the States. And people surmise that this is why the problem gambling rates are lower there as well, because there are these lower bet and win sizes. Remove bet maximum coin features is another idea. Removing, and not just an idea, some places this has been implemented, removing bill acceptors or restricting these bill acceptors to small bills, dispensing payouts in cash rather than tokens or tickets, which could be immediately regambled, requiring loss limits. For instance, in Missouri, I believe, until 2008, there was a $500 loss limit. But mind you, this was a 2-hour riverboat ride, so it was a kind of unique setup. Showing bet amounts in cash rather than as credits, or showing them in terms of your win-loss ratio. And then decreasing the number of lines on which to bet. Next slide. And I'm not going to get into this, very complicated, but on this last item, problem gamblers are known to play the largest number of possible lines with the minimum bet per line. This is called the min-max, or perhaps it's mini-maxi play strategy. So regulating this, it appears, really does target, reaches that sweet spot of targeting problem gamblers while not really interfering with non-problem gamblers. Yet very few jurisdictions impose these kinds of limits. One exception is in Australia, where no more than 50 lines are permissible, and in Queensland and 30 in Tasmania. And you may say, wow, 50 is a lot, but keep in mind that it goes to 100, 200 lines is quite common. And the final sort of collection, how am I doing on time? I have 2 more minutes? Okay. The final sort of collection would be these, again, others here have done research on this. Reality check messages to bring players back to awareness. This has been a big focus of machine modification. You could see it as a kind of more progressive or radical version of posters and pamphlets of consumer education in a way, but it's more of an intervention. Click. And along with these various different kinds of messages that are proposed are also the question of how to deliver messages. Do you want to pop them? Do you want to flash them? Do you want to scroll them right to left, up to down? It has been shown, there's been actually quite a lot of studies on this, that dynamic translucent messages that scroll across the screen work better than static messages to get gamblers' attention and effectively reduce problem play. So I just wanted to put up what objections to this could be, and this objection would be unintended consequences. And here's a statement from the Gaming Association speaking directly to this, that changing the machine doesn't help the person. Gamblers will adjust their behavior to compensate for technology-based attempts to limit their gambling, etc. I actually agree with this in many cases. Slow down the rate of play, people will play longer. You can find these, but not across the board. It's not so simple as anything you do, the gambler is going to bypass it. That's too easy. It may or may not be true that some of these have unintended consequences. To my mind, that's not a reason to do nothing. And what that statement leaves out is the fact that there is evidence, actually, that some of the measures I've reviewed actually work, by which I mean they reduce problem gambling without compromising the experience for everyone. So, last slide, last 2 slides. To answer what does work, I would turn to the recent, and direct you all to the recent comprehensive study by Bob Williams, who's a key member of the Sigma team and a highly regarded researcher internationally. This is his summary of gambling machine parameter modifications here. I won't read it all exhaustively, but he basically says some really do appear to reduce harm, eliminating early big wins, slower speed of play, reducing the number of betting lines, eliminating bill acceptors, and the dynamic pop-up messages, reducing maximum bet size, and probably something that will never come to pass here in the States, taking the seats away. Duh. So there's, he also says there's insufficient evidence to support things like, there's a lot of concern always on what's the payback rate. That doesn't seem to really, for various detailed reasons I won't get into, have an effect. Minute maximum win size doesn't. Mandatory cash outs don't seem to have an effect, nor do on-screen clocks. So there's some things that appear to work and some that don't. And finally, again, I would point you to his article. He does a nice job. I've just plucked a few out of sort of recommending what the best practices are. If scientific research should guide policy, as the Reno model and other frameworks suggest, it's clear that there is evidence to suggest that Massachusetts has at its fingertips some a number of very compelling things it could do. The evidence also suggests what will not be so helpful. For example, the most commonly adopted prevention measures are awareness and information campaigns, responsible gambling features, posters, casino self-exclusion. Those are the least effective, and there is evidence for that. So not that they're bad or shouldn't exist, but it's clear, it's clearly been shown that those don't work as well. Final click. So there's going to be more evidence coming on board thanks to the player tracking statute that exists in Massachusetts, which offers this really remarkable opportunity, I think, to gather evidence for what are the most harmful aspects of gamblers and gambling machines, what are the best ways to mitigate those, and also what doesn't work so well to mitigate those. So like it or not, we're going to have here in Massachusetts a kind of laboratory for gathering scientific evidence to answer some of these really compelling questions in the field of problem gambling, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. And next up, on our whirlwind tour of responsible gambling components, advertising and marketing practices, and this one's mine. Go ahead. So there's two basic rationales for why we need to have different advertising and marketing kind of prohibitions out there. And basically, when we talk about marketing and advertising, they fall into the category of either prohibitions or signage requirements is generally how they fall. And for the prohibitions, the idea there is that, well, you know, the assumption is casino gambling has a causal relationship with some social ills, and if we aggressively advertise, then people are going to gamble more, or perhaps people who otherwise may not choose to gamble may be enticed to do so. The empirical research, I'm not going to go into the first one about the social ills, but there's a little bit of empirical research that starts gleaning information on the second assumption, and that is, does advertising promote or impact gambling behavior? And what a few studies, and again, this is a very small body of research out there specifically on gambling advertising, but what it's found is there's a few reports. One is there is a association between those that gamble and those that recognize gambling advertising. This shouldn't come as a big surprise to any of you. If you're interested in a certain topic, you're going to be more prone to actually observe it and recall that promotion. There's also some research that's been done with young people. This is an area of concern. And what that body of research has found in general, and also specifically to gaming, is that young people do seem more susceptible to advertising in general, and that would include gambling advertising. Um, You could read the other two, and just, I'm going to really try to zip through these. Now, the National Gaming Impact Study has looked at this issue of advertising and wanted to inform regulatory bodies out there and others on how to move forward addressing the issue of advertising and gambling. And this is back in 1999, and their recommendations are regulatory agencies should ban aggressive advertising, especially for those that might be considered at-risk populations, and the ones they pointed out were impoverished neighborhoods and youth. And that operators and associations of gambling organizations voluntarily adopt enforceable advertising guidelines. And I think what we've seen since that time, as these recommendations have been pretty much applied. And next slide. And one of what I view as a prevailing opinion that was written by Mark Griffiths was that that there is a lack of research in this area. However, there's reason to believe that gambling advertising should fall into the same categories or similar categories as what we know about alcohol and tobacco promotion, and that body of research is much deeper. And that we need to be cautious in the way that we move forward with the advertising of gaming products. You know, the next set is really guidelines around marketing and communication practices. And there's quite a few out there at this point. And here's just a couple of examples. The Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation, advertising the Code of Advertising Standards. I think it's one of the better ones out there. What they did is they broke it down into these categories, which you see in front of you. Compliant basically means compliant with other regulations around advertising. There's broader regulations kind of out there about truth and fairness. And so that the gambling advertisements should comply with broader codes. That they be honest, fair, and open, that they include responsible gambling messaging, they protect minors, there's limitations around promotions, and they reflect the Nova Scotia values. Next. Western Cape advertising standards. Again, these are just two that I kind of picked out of several that are out there. And they organize a little differently around content, tone, specifically around minors, how to avoid advertising being particularly attractive to minors. And there's a section on game information, so that there's transparency in the way that the games are, the public is educated about these games. Now, signage requirements, this is another area of kind of rule that we often see in various jurisdictions. Go ahead. Now, again, not a large body of research, but some of the research that is out there on signage, I think, is encouraging. And that is that patrons recognize signs so that they are observed and remembered by patrons in gaming facilities regarding that there is help available. They may not recall the specific number, but they know kind of that there is a helpline and that there are services. And that the casino management and staff find this particular area of responsible gambling as helpful. And then lastly, there's some reports that suggest that problem gamblers find this information particularly useful, that the place that many of them get information of where to go from help is actually in the gaming venue. And the last slide is just an example of that last point. Go ahead and keep clicking. And just click away. Don't pay attention to this big graph. The big graph that's going to pop up there, it's too small for you to see, but it just shows that over time we're kind of tracking some things. But really what I want to point out is that and this work was done in Oregon, where over 1,500 problem gamblers come into treatment each year into its public system, where we're able to collect some pretty good information. And the number one place by far that gamblers who come into treatment get their information is at the gaming venue itself. So that adds the credence that there is quite a bit of importance of having good signage in the gaming facilities. seats even do. And that might put us back up to, back to our schedule. So once you now turn it over, unless there's, unless any questions around signage and, so with that, Dr. Leah Nauer.
You're next. Player information.
We're not sitting our, I was thrown, because we're not sitting, what that we're presenting.
Okay. Be prepared to click quickly. I'm on it. Hi there. Everybody awake? Yes. Okay. Well, this will put you to sleep. I'm going to talk about key elements of informed choice. And Howard Schaefer, Bob Ladouceur, Alex Blazinski, and I did a paper that we published, and I'm going to go over some of the elements. We sort of distilled a lot of the things that we, a lot of the different things from a lot of these things that you've been listening to into one sort of framework article. So, go ahead. The key elements of informed choice, and this was from the IPART kind of distilled these: the promotion of informed choice for the community, improved measures to protect gamblers, and more effective and efficient counseling services. And so those are the major components that when we're thinking about what goes into these, this is what we're trying to make sure we have this balanced on all these levels. So requirements for informed choice, competence, you can sort of put these up quickly, that the individual is able and competent to make reasoned decisions based on information provided, that there's disclosure and understanding, that there's an awareness of the characteristics, operations, and nature of the products, and an awareness of the risks, implications, and consequences of consuming the products. So part of what sort of has come to the forefront in these discussions is, well, either we don't understand the difference between a real reel and a virtual reel, we just don't understand that all these components came into play, or you know, we don't have, can you put the other slide back up there? Sorry, I'm not used to not doing my own slides, so it's kind of, so the person feels like that if I only would have known. Now, those of us that have treated problem gamblers for years and years know that that's only marginally true. I mean, a lot of them know and they still go ahead anyway, but that's been one of the argument, and that there's not adequate disclosure about the different mechanisms, the odds, and how that would affect them. Although, as we just heard, the return to player, the hit rate, those types of things, while they're conceptually important, they haven't proven to really have any real effect on player behavior. Okay, go ahead. So the first thing we look at is the characteristics of the information. Is it relevant to the product? Is it accurate in its content, not misleading or deceitful, accessible to all potential participants, provided in an understandable form, provided in full, and delivered in a timely fashion? So when we're sort of thinking about, when we're thinking what information should we provide, you sort of want to hit all of those notes and be sure that whatever you're providing encompasses those things. When you're thinking about people's attitudes, you want to think about whether it warns of potential risks and harms associated with gambling, informs players of the operation and characteristics of games. There's a lot of people who think the more lines they play, the more chance they have of winning, when we know that's not true. So that's the type of information. And there have been different places that have really done a good job. I went to in Sydney, they had this, it was not put on by gambling people, but they had done a lot of informed choice things just to teach your average person about games and how they work, and can you guess this? What would you think if you were given this? And it's amazing how we don't really know a lot about how these things work. It informs the players of the probabilities of winning, the role, if any, of any skill where the outcome is determined by chance. So people that think, you know, I can learn to play video poker with the same level of skill that I can play poker at a table. You know, is that true? Is that not true? What's the actual information? It should, whoa. I talk fast, but it should foster responsible gambling practices, assist gamblers in monitoring levels of expenditure in terms of time and money. So it should help people, and we've just done these studies in Canada that we haven't published yet, where we put virtual headsets on people, and we looked at behavioral economics paradigms where we looked at decision-making under situations of risk. And so if a person's under a win-loss condition, and if they set for themselves a subjective versus an objective goal, how will that influence their chasing behavior? And so some of what we were looking at is if people are losing and they objectively know, well, this is how much an average person would lose in an hour, and they're losing more, does this affect whether they persist? And so that's sort of, those kind of mechanisms that sort of help that person gauge themselves against the average person, figure out, is sort of a key to them sort of thinking, well, maybe I need to slow down, or that type of thing. So when we started sort of looking at this, we took all the different decision-making models that we could find, and I'm going to go over them really quickly. The cognitive ones are the ones that pertain most to gambling. So in health, we looked at health models, which basically ask the consumer, do the costs outweigh the benefits? Do you have a sense of personal efficacy? Do you believe you're capable of performing the behavior despite obstacles? So does the person think that they can control their gambling, or do they feel that they're not in control? Are the positive byproducts of discontinuing the behavior significant enough? And we know, and there's a lot of, part of the reason why gambling has moved out of impulse control is because it's not really true in the classical sense that it's a compulsion. The reality is, for most people, gambling is an ego-syntonic, not ego-dystonic activity, which is why people persist a lot of times in the face of all these adverse consequences. So what are the positive byproducts of me stopping? And when you do this cost-benefit analysis, they have to outweigh the benefits of continuing. What are the attitudes and/or social norms that determine intentions, which in turn guide behavior? Those are some things that we took away from the health models. Go ahead. Now, the cognitive models are the ones you probably are more familiar with, which is what we talk about traditionally in gambling. That psychological distress results from dysfunctional belief schemas or structures, that an individual's interpretation of events determine how a person will feel or behave, and identifying and modifying dysfunctional belief structures will, actually should say should, change behaviors and emotions. So when we look at gambling, of course, the core dysfunctional cognitive beliefs are the illusions of control, where I somehow believe that I can control the outcome of random events. Superstitious beliefs, if I just have one more little troll with purple hair at my bingo game, I'm going to win. That was my grandmother's belief system. Biased evaluation, if the sun is shining at the game, the longer that I play, I don't think we have gambler's fallacy up there, which we should, but if my system doesn't work with sports betting, it's because it rained, and then the erroneous perceptions of randomness, not realizing we're taught in our lives to view things in terms of patterns, and here there's no patterns. Just because 3 came up, 3 times doesn't make it any more or less likely to come up the next time. So this is sort of what the cognitive model actually looks like. You have these beliefs that you can control the outcome, that you want to feel powerful, important. You develop these superstitions around gambling, and you overestimate the likelihood of winning. Then when you have a stressor at work, that triggers these beliefs, and you feel anxiety and your heart racing, and you have these thoughts, which we call in cognitive behavioral therapy automatic thoughts. I'm an incompetent person, I'm a loser, I'll never be good enough. You feel depressed, and all that sort of comes together, and you gamble. You start gambling or you gamble more. So some of the things you want to think about when you're looking at informed decision-making from a cognitive perspective, is there any evidence for this belief? What is the evidence against this belief? So these are things, when you're designing things for gamblers, they need objective evidence of you know, am I gambling to excess? Is this a smart thing for me to continue pursuing? And when you're thinking about how you're going to develop interventions, you have to have these sort of as the basis of your thought process. What is the worst thing that can happen if you abandon the belief? What is the best thing that can happen if you abandon the belief? So you have this very complicated model of vulnerability factors and all your behaviors, thoughts, emotions, the precipitants or the triggers, then the maintaining factors, psychological, social, environmental, and comorbidity, and then your treatment moderators, your motivation, your social support, your treatment expectations, and all these things kind of coalesce. So small wonder that when reviewing the literature on why these things do or don't work, that a lot of them don't work, because this is an enormously complex and individual process. And we're trying to superimpose a generalization on something that is very, very person-specific. So what we're trying to do overall, those are like the major models that we found that sort of pertain to this. But what we're trying to do is to provide relevant educational information that's necessary to objectively evaluate your gambling options and modify erroneous cognitions. That's kind of it in a three-point nutshell. We want to detail the benefits of responsible gambling and potential social and personal costs of excessive gambling, to provide sufficient guidelines to assist individuals in identifying their current level of responsible gambling, and target specific gambling activities, social demographic groups, and stages of change to promote optimal information dissemination, and to use several mediums, because like those of us that teach college students or other students know, you know, somebody understands a test, somebody understands a little essay, somebody understands short answer, and somebody wants to write a paper. So it's the same way with this. You have to have different mediums. You don't know what's really going to really get through to a particular individual. So relevant questions to ask. So when you're looking at industry and marketing promotion, what, if any, game-related information would best contribute to gamblers making better informed choices? What is the effect of general industry marketing and promotion on the initiation of youth gambling, and can this effect be minimized by harm reduction and prevention programs? What elements of information are necessary for individuals to make healthy and responsible gambling choices? So of all those models we looked at, which things do we think are the most important? Which ones really bear the most on what we're trying to do here? What impact, if any, do casino-sponsored responsible gambling policies have on individual gambling choices? Like all of these things that we just heard that have been tried, what impact do they have? Well, Rob Williams found some of them seem to have impact and some don't seem to have as much. And then finally, the guidelines that we came up with for promoting informed choice. So on a universal, sort of on a macro level, educate people on the nature of gambling as entertainment. This isn't an income-generating activity. Dispel myths that gamblers can beat the house, explain probability, odds, hit rate, return to player, provide sufficient information on individual games to promote limit setting, increase awareness of risk associated with excessive gambling. And then on sort of a meso level, like gambler-specific information or micro level for people who aren't necessarily disordered, provide detail and interactive information regarding specific games. Create promotional materials, resources, and referrals for those who gamble for non-entertainment purposes. They have these for alcohol in senior centers and that. They don't have them for gambling, despite the fact that buses pick them up in New Jersey and take them to Atlantic City. Develop educational materials that identify gambling-related erroneous cognitions and counter belief with information. So know if you sit at that slot machine, because you've just put $10,000 in it, doesn't make it any more likely to pay off, so yes, you can go to the bathroom. I mean, those are the kind of things that people say, well, if I get up, then the next person's going to win a windfall. Develop user-friendly screens to, that's okay, to promote identification of the signs and symptoms of problem gambling behaviors. Provide concise, repetitive messages to heighten self-awareness regarding expenditures and patterns of play. Go ahead. And then when we're looking just at problem gamblers, what should informed choice what should constitute informed choice for problem gamblers, provide assessment guidelines for determining the relevant health of one's gambling behavior and the position along the spectrum, which is what some of these manufacturers like PlayScan and that are trying to do, with pictures, with sliders, with things from a, you know, a sunny smiley face to a red frowny face. I mean, to give a person a visual as well as sort of a diagnosis health-wise. Offer resources and referrals for counseling, hotline, self-exclusion, and self-help services. Provide cost-related information designed to educate problem gamblers on the financial and legal risks of excessive gambling. And develop strategies for adopting gambling limits and increasing responsible gambling behavior. And that's it. Thank you.
Dr. Lattisaur? This is quite a whirlwind, isn't it?
Oh, well, that worked. Where I sit?
While we're waiting for the equipment to get set up, if there's any questions for Nia?
I think I better change the slide myself because it will come in a progressive way and it will be complicated. What we'll outline is to give you an idea of what the pre-commitment is, and I've called it the pre-commitment is the smart card that's smart. As you know, the pre-commitment essentially was to have a card that you pre-commit the amount of time and money that you want to spend over a period of time, and when the card, when your time or money is over, the machine will not be activated by the card. This is what we call the smart card, or what I call is the smart card that smart. So I'll tell you about what was the trigger of having the mandatory pre-commitment, the rationale, and the main results. Well, that was in a paper that was published about a few months ago by Alex Basinski and Danielle Lalonde. In 2010, in Australia, there was an election, and Julia Gillard negotiated with Andrew Wilkie that if they do get in power, they will introduce the mandatory pre-commitment on all poker machines in the country. And as you may know, she was elected prime minister. That created a fantastic political and scientific debate. The government established a series of meetings with experts from the industry and from research, and a lot of people were strongly for the pre-commitment, and some were strongly against this system. Interestingly, in our review on the pre-commitment, we found 218 papers. Among them, 92% were opinion-based, and only 8% were based on data. Well, this concept was introduced, the pre-commitment, by an Australian, Mark Dickerson, who had the following rationale. In his study, he found that while gambling, the majority of the gamblers lose control while they gamble. So, what is going on when they gamble, it seems that your cognitive states or your decision-making, like Leah just mentioned, may be blurred by different aspects. You dissociate, and the gamblers tell us that while we gamble, we forget about what's going on, and they have all kind of erroneous perception. And I certainly not can disagree with that. Therefore, we should make the decision before we start gambling instead of while we do gamble. So the pre-commitment makes a lot of sense. Do we have enough evidence to implement such a mandatory system to all machines in a given jurisdiction? Well, let's see the empirical result. And for 5 minutes, I will bombard you with some data, empirical data. The first one is a prevalence study that was conducted in Norway. In 1907, all machines were removed in Norway. A year later, they introduced a machine with a mandatory pre-commitment on. And interestingly, the prevalence of problem gambling rose from 1.3 to 2.1. Why is that? Well, there are many explanations. Among them, we can see that there was a migration from low-intensity machine to the internet, or there may be some more moving to illegal gambling. All those pieces of data, you will see, I'll make a wrap-up at the end and hope to inform you, commissioners, about the pre-commitment. There were 3 studies conducted in Canada and Nova Scotia, and we'll go roughly over the 3 studies. There were machines modified in 10 different venues in Nova Scotia. They had 121 regular gamblers, and the participants were not required to use the card every time they do gamble. The results are based on self-report. Well, let's see the main result. 45% use the card every time they gamble. 87% use the summary statement. That means how much money they put in the machine, they've lost, or the time they spent. And 52% limit sitting option. They use that. 80% reported that they played more responsibly with the card, but 44% removed the card and continued gambling. The main characteristic of the study was that the card was mandatory, but the options were not mandatory. That's the second study. That was conducted in Las Vegas in a lab. The subjects were not using their own money to participate in the study. The main results were that 75% said they supported pre-commitment, 60% said that they played more responsibly and they spent less money, 51% of the participants used at least one responsible gambling feature, and the most popular one was the summary of the expenditure. But card swapping was very oftenly reported. There was no actual reporting of the expenditure. And the summary of the losses that we think makes a lot of sense in some participant, it triggered chasing behavior. So when I realize that I've lost $200 and I should stop, as we expect, that triggers that I should continue gambling to win back my losses. The third study that was conducted in Nova Scotia was 161 regular players. The study was carried in the natural environment. The card use was mandatory, but the features were optional. And there was some measure, the self-report and behavioral measure. What are the results? Well, 60% reported occasional or regular use of the responsible gambling feature, mainly the summary of their behavior. 70% reported that the system helped them to play more responsibly, and 57% reported spending less time and money. But 50% borrowed a card of their friend to continue playing, And if we take only the gamblers who use their own card, 55% reduce their expenditure, 6 reported no change, but 27 increase their expenditure with the mandatory pre-commitment card. Card swapping was frequent, 30% increased their expenditure. There were 3 studies in Australia, and I'll go pretty fast, but I want to show you the main conclusion. 2 trials were conducted in the metropolitan venues, and the main characteristics was 52 gamblers were recruited on site. We don't know how many were asked to participate. The design includes 35-minute telephone interview and 3 focus groups. The main results: use of the responsible gambling feature was low. 79% reported no impact. Only 10 participants reported that they were spending less with the card. And the post-hoc analysis showed that 42% spent less, 5 no changes, and 53% spent more money gambling. There was a second arm of that study, but very few people accepted to participate, so the results cannot be discussed yet. The third study, there were 2 arms. Again, very small sample. No conclusion can be outlined. In the study 2, there were difficulty in recruitment. Only 91% completed the telephone survey. That was in 6 hotel venues. The patrons were able to play with or without the use of the card, and the main results were 62% increased their awareness about their expenditure, 47% expressed more confidence playing the electronic gaming machine, 33% rated the responsible gambling device as useful, and 60% reported setting a limit higher than the amount they usually spent. Why is the last point that? And the analogy I like to give is, let's say on every Friday evening I go to a bar and I drink 2 beers. So I have to pre-commit and I will sign for 2 beers. But a good friend of mine pops in the bar that I haven't seen him for a while. So I had my 2 beers, I will order a 3rd beer. The waiter will say, "No, Bob, you had your 2 beers, you cannot have a 3rd. The next time I pre-commit, what will I do? I will pre-commit to 5 beers in case of a friend comes in. So what are the main conclusions on the mandatory pre-commit? That makes a lot of sense. The rationale is outstanding, but as my friend Howard, a fantastic paper I think he wrote on conventional wisdom or common sense, it may look good, but the main results and the conclusion we can make is very, very small sample and unrepresentative sample. We rely mainly on self-report data. Failure to control for non-card use. Card swapping was very frequent. Some gamblers increase their expenditure instead of lowering it. Chasing losses was quite often in response to the information they got. And they set higher limits than they would normally do. So my conclusion based on data is mandatory pre-commitment was suggested for political reasons instead of scientific reasons. And this is what I like to warn you about. Things may make a lot of sense, but we need data to evaluate if the expected results are reached. And I will just finish with my preferred slide. I call it the famous unknown man, who said something like that. I don't like data. They make me insecure because they're changing all the time. I prefer opinions. I prefer my opinions because my opinions are stable, permanent, and resistant to any change. Thank you very much.
And next up, we have Keith White.
All right, so I'm going to be real brief. I have no slides. Marco asked me to talk about kind of behavioral tracking systems, and ironically, both Debbie and Howard kind of did all the research on this. So I'm not going to regurgitate their research because I would probably mess it up anyways. But what I would like to say is that we believe this offers a window into the soul, if you will. That their behavioral tracking data provides a great starting point, but it's important, or it provides a great responsible gaming tool. But it's really important to say this is not the magic bullet. And maybe even a couple of years ago, I said that as these loyalty club systems really become very complex and sophisticated, as we move on to the internet, and their team has collected some amazing data about player behavior on the internet, because it's all tracked by the very nature of the beast. That was really going to unlock some of these existential questions we've had about why people develop gambling problems and stuff. It's not going to be that for any number of reasons, but I think it can be a very powerful tool, but limited tool. And so it's helpful for those of you that haven't been in the industry for a long time to think about where this stuff came from. Behavioral tracking systems, started out way back in the 80s, and it was simply denomination of the slot machine times time on device. And then there's a little bit of magic sauce, because if someone was playing a quarter machine and you knew that they were playing for half an hour or 2 hours or whatever it was, you could do some basic math and figure out their lifetime value. What the casino would expect on average that player to return. And that was the basis of these early rating systems, where instead of necessarily time on slot machine, it was time at the table. If you're playing a $20 a hand and you're playing for 6 hours, based on the theoretical win, or based on the kind of rules of the table, the casino would know that you'd multiply that by a certain number and you'd get to that estimated lifetime value. I mean, it was very, very crude. It was predictive in the sense that this was based on general averages. Since that time, in the last 30, 35 years, we've gotten a lot better at this stuff. Not only is now many more aspects of play tracked within these systems, but they are married with other databases as well. Your purchase within the casino, your purchases outside the casino. So again, but one of the major limitations of this, one of the things that is obvious now, is that it only captures your play within that certain property, right? And that is if you choose to be rated. So there's this whole thing about there's a lot of people who have loyalty cards that don't use them, and there's also a lot of people who never use loyalty cards at all, or they use them inconsistently. And that doesn't track anybody's, that's just your play within the property. You have this same phenomenon on the internet, of course. You're tracked within one site, but then when you leave and you go to somewhere else or you go to another site. So the data is helpful. I think one of the underlying principles of informed player choice that behavioral tracking does help is that it helps us think about social norms. Again, a lot of our data on social norms has been based on self-report. And the more we can get a second kind of objective, different lens to look at what is normative behavior, that's going to help us work back to find the social norms and then, where folks deviate. So it's a very powerful tool. There's at least 4 systems right now operating, in the market, even in the online space. So there's BetBuddy, there's PlayScan, there's Mentor, there's what 888 developed. And these are producing lots of information, again, that Debbie and her colleagues have done some great work on it, so I won't belabor that, except to say it's useful to a point, but it's not the be-all and end-all. But what I would like to say, and when we in the question and answer space, you guys can talk a little bit more about what you found on the internet, I hope, because I think that is very interesting. What I would like to talk about, though, is something that hasn't come up here yet, that I think adds yet another lens to look at this behavior, and that is looking at follow the money. Okay, so as money becomes increasingly digital, and even way back when, in the days of, for those of you that are veterans, central credit, what you have are a very small group of companies that are providing basically money to gamblers across all their gambling behavior. So Central Credit would give every casino a credit score and a long-term value of these particular customers. So it wasn't restricted just to a single property. It was restricted to someone, someone could be tracked across their spend, usually within the industry segment. So, Central Credit would see how you played within the casinos, but it wouldn't count for lottery play and things like that. Now we've gone one step further, and with prepaid cards, for example, once someone, because one of the other things about, I'm sorry, I should step back. One of the other things about behavioral tracking data is it's generally not at the level we get. It doesn't identify particular customers, and I think there's lots of reasons why it shouldn't. There's all sorts of human protections and privacy protections and things like that. But by definition, payment processing does. It has to. And so when you're able to look, as you're able to do now, and look at someone's, if they're using credit, prepaid cards, even some loyalty card systems that are hooked into payment systems, by definition, you follow that player's activity across all the gaming platforms they interact with. And so I was talking to some industry folks at the conference that Judge McHugh and I were at, and they said, well, we had someone who, we were watching literally, somebody won a jackpot, they put it into a stored value card, we saw that they then went and had a great meal, spent a couple $100s on dinner at this property. And then 2 days later, they cashed $2,000 of this winning at a different casino right down the road. They didn't go back to the casino where they won at. And then 2 days later, they were also cashing out. And so they, is that indicative of problem gambling behavior? I don't know, but it's an interesting pattern that you wouldn't have collected any other way. So I guess one of the things I would say is that, sort of player behavioral tracking data 1.0 is what we already have from loyalty systems, what we can get from all these, and it's envisioned in the Massachusetts law. That's what we're going to get. I think behavioral tracking 2.0 is following the money and looking at as all this cash becomes digital in all sorts of various platforms. There are some very interesting things we can do that is going to capture play across segment and across platform. And theoretically, you're going to capture internet play because by definition, you're not using cash when you gamble on the internet. You're going to capture the social play. And if you look at many of these payment processors, they're very aggressively moving into these more technological markets, if you will. And what they will tell you, if you read the industry trades and if you talk to them, they will be able to track and sell back to the gaming industry that picture of a customer that they've never been able to have before. You're going to get the customer's behavior across multiple properties and platforms by following their money trail rather than working backwards and just following their activity within a certain property or within a certain segment. So I think, I won't get into detail, but I do think that there's, just to say that on the behavioral tracking side, information is power. And what we've seen is some limited research and evidence that even in, as Robert said, even in Norway, and PlayScan has done some evaluations. Most of these schemes are voluntary. Not everybody uses them. Those who do use them tend to be heavier gamblers. They tend to be more active gamblers. And the more likely you are to be at risk in general, the more likely you are to use some of these features. Now, there's not a perfect correlation. Some riskier gamblers use some more of the limit setting and less of the behavioral analysis. But by and large, in general, there's some promising approaches. But again, you also have to think very much about the type of groups we're targeting. Are we targeting problem gamblers and using behavioral tracking to identify and intervene with them? That's one whole discussion. Are we targeting at-risk gamblers? Or are we targeting people that are not problem gamblers and trying to keep them at normative levels? I mean, I think you can do all three, but we have to really distinguish between what it is you're trying to use this data for and how you use it. And the same thing applies, obviously, to their payments side. But I think that, for my money, is going to become the most promising area of the window into the player's soul, if you will, watching how they play across different platforms and across different segments of the industry. So we'll leave the Q&A for later, but that's behavioral tracking in a very quick nutshell.
We do
I just wanted to make one, since apparently we're ahead of schedule, I just wanted to clarify that the data that's actually mandated in the statute here in Massachusetts is not the same data that you're referring to. You said essentially this is what we're going to get. Actually, it's pretty unprecedented and new in lots of ways. One way is that it will be linked across sites in Massachusetts. Another way is that you're going to know a whole set of levels that hasn't been collected and known before, like what games, how many lines are being played, what are the game features, an incredibly exciting, unprecedented, robust data set to look at. And I'm surprised in your comments that you didn't mention the was so-called addiction algorithm that was developed by Tracy Schranz and Tom Shelnick in Canada, which has, using tracking data, been able to identify a slide toward problematic behavior before any counselor or even the individual themselves would notice. It's to 95% accuracy at this point, and it's measuring variables across 500 different points. And I think that's quite exciting. And the thing about money, I hadn't heard that before, and that's really interesting, but my first reaction would be that at the moment, for instance, Gary Loveman put a firewall between all financial information and marketing systems and tracking because of the liability, right? The liability issues that you're going to get sued if we know that players, how much they have in their accounts and how much they're spending, and we're marketing to them, that's just too frightening for the industry. And so he put an absolute firewall there. So I'm just curious to see how feasible that actually is as a promising new direction with the money, given the touchiness of that and the privacy issues around banking information, et cetera. So I just wanted to make those 3 comments.
And we do have time for other comments if anybody on the panel has anything further to add. All right, then, Dr. Five.
Okay, first, Chair Crosby and the commissioners and Mark, I just want to thank you all for inviting me here to introduce the topic of employee training. And as we all know, gambling is expanding worldwide, and key stakeholders such as yourself have responded to this expansion by requiring a lot of different things of operators, including employee training. And employee training programs really have proliferated in response to all of this. Now, although there are a lot of employee training programs that are out there around the world, very few of them have been actually evaluated. When I was preparing these slides, I did a quick database search of PsycInfo and found just 4 peer-reviewed evaluations of employee responsible gambling programs. I think 2 of them were Bob's, 1 was ours, maybe 1 Bo Barnhard was involved in. So I think with these programs, there is some type of a presumption of efficacy that goes on, but the reality is a little bit different and it's a little bit less clear. The problem with all of this, speaking as a scientist, is without evaluation, we don't really know whether the program's results will be positive, whether they'll be beneficial for the employees and patrons, whether they'll be negative, or whether they'll be neutral and have no effect whatsoever. Now, as Dr. Schaefer shared this morning, ideally, when you develop a program like this, you're going to want to integrate into it some type of an evaluation system. And perhaps the most important part of that is that feedback loop. So as you move from developing the program to monitoring, to assessing, to summarizing, you're going to want to provide feedback to the people who created and who are using the program so that they can be sure that the effects of the program are what they actually have intended. Now, I think that program evaluation is important for a lot of reasons, and it's not just because I think science is cool. It's also important because casino employees themselves are a rapidly expanding workforce, and we need to understand what is going on within that workforce. These employees have contact with a customer base that regularly is engaging in very risky behaviors: smoking, drinking, gambling, other things. And these employees also often are required to facilitate help seeking, either personally, they directly need to do this, or impersonally, they need to know where to send people to provide that help. And then finally, as was mentioned a couple of times this morning, employees themselves are at risk for gambling-related problems. So being required to participate in these types of programs hopefully would have some type of, extra benefit for those employees who might be struggling. Okay. So a couple of years ago, the division had an opportunity to evaluate a responsible gambling training program at a large resort-style casino out in Las Vegas. Okay. And what we were able to do was we were able to survey all new employees who were hired between July and December 2008. And then we were able to survey them again about a month later after they had completed their orientation. And what we wanted to understand, since there was so little literature out there about how well employee training programs actually work, we wanted to understand what are the effects of their training on employees' knowledge related to things like disordered gambling, opinions towards gambling, and their ability to implement responsible gambling practices. Okay, so this is too small for most everyone to see, but for people who are interested, this is how we got to our analytic sample of 217 employees, and we were able to follow about 56% of those employees over time. Okay. Most of the employees that we looked at were female in their mid-30s from the United States and had about 4 years of experience in the casino industry. Most spoke English, but a very sizable proportion spoke another language primarily in their home. Okay. Most of the people that we surveyed were part of the hotel operations. 32% were frontline casino services employees, about a third. And the survey that we utilized had 44 questions, and we asked a very wide variety of questions related to their individual demographics and health characteristics, their own knowledge about disordered gambling, their knowledge about their casinos' responsible gambling policies and what they should do about them, and their own personal opinions about responsible gambling and gambling-related problems. So what did we do with all of this information? Well, we took it and we did what scientists do. We did some analytics and we came up with some merit scores, which is basically the amount of correct information that people were reporting on their surveys, and we also gave them demerit scores, the amount of incorrect information that people were reporting on their surveys. We examined their pre-post changes from baseline, pre-orientation to about 1 month later. And we also examined their pre-orientation surveys to determine whether there were natural knowledge groups among employees. What do I mean by that? Natural groupings of people who were already coming in with information and ideas about gambling. Maybe you want to call it their responsible gambling IQ or something like that. We examined all of this information for the overall programmatic impact because we wanted to understand whether training programs could actually put a dent in what people knew about responsible gambling. And we also wanted to look at divergent impact, where the program worked, where the program didn't work. And then finally, differentiated impact, whether or not the program worked differently for different people. So here's what we found as far as overall programmatic impact. And we felt like this was pretty promising, that these responsible gambling training programs could teach employees, even those who had been in the field for 4 years, could teach them some information about responsible gambling. Overall, we found a 15% increase in responsible gambling knowledge, and we could break that down. Our survey broke down into some sub-areas. Understanding what addiction actually was, we found about an 11% increase. Gambling and public health, 16%. Their understanding of gaming regulations improved by 18%. And their understanding of science and best business practices improved by 20%. But we did find that the program had some divergent impact. So what you can see on the left, and it's very small print, I understand, are the changes in the merit scores. So the orange bars are their pre-orientation merit scores, and the brown bars are their post-orientation scores. And you can see that for all the areas of our survey, there was a significant increase, significant improvement in what they answered correctly. The graph on the right, in contrast, displays their demerit scores. And what we found is that there was no difference. We really weren't making a big impact on fixing the incorrect knowledge that the employees have. So there was a perseverance effect. The people who had misinformation and believed it we couldn't dissuade them through this program of that misinformation. The last point from this study that I want to highlight relates to the differentiated impact of the program. And we could look at this in a bunch of different ways. We could see whether the program worked better for men and women, or for people who've been in the industry for 5 or more years or fewer, by age, all sorts of different things like that. And what we decided to look at it was in terms of their natural knowledge groups. Most of the trainings that are out there have a one-size-fits-all presentation. That is, you develop a program, you go in, and all the new employees who are required to take it get the same basic presentation. There's a baseline presentation, and everyone gets the same thing. And we wondered whether or not this was appropriate. So what we did was we looked at their baseline scores, and we did some analytics, which included things like cluster analysis. And we found that prior to orientation, that there were some pretty clear groupings for the employees. What we found was that 19% answered our survey, and they were completely correct on all of the items that we assessed them on. We called those individuals oriented. They were already oriented in the direction that we wanted them to be. Almost 60% we called pre-oriented, and those individuals didn't complete the survey with distinction, but they didn't make so many errors that it really set off any kind of warning flags. About 23%, which is pretty meaningful, were what we called disoriented. And these were people who answered so much information and so many questions incorrectly, and in ways that we thought were concerning, that they deserve special attention. So what does disorientation look like? So, here's an example of a disorientation item that these people tended to endorse. They suggested that regulations require that employee responsible gaming training programs include instructions for diagnosing disordered gambling. Exposure to certain objects, like drugs, always causes addiction. The prevalence of pathological gambling in the US is 10 to 20%. Risking gambling is risking something on the outcome of an event when the outcome is certain. Employees should take it upon themselves to determine if someone has a gambling-related problem and stop him or her from gambling. So we thought that some of these things were a little bit alarming, and that these people probably should require a little bit, maybe more intensive training. And just for the visually minded, here's what these knowledge groups looked like at baseline. And on the far left, the orange bars, you can see the disoriented groups performed much more poorly on the survey than those who were pre-oriented and oriented, the brown and yellow bars respectively. Okay. So self-reported job category, whether they were frontline employees, restaurant workers, hotel services, that didn't relate to orientation group. Age didn't relate to orientation group, so this wasn't a young, old thing. Number of years in the gaming industry, surprisingly, didn't relate to orientation group. Here's what did relate. The disoriented group was more likely to have larger proportions of women and employees who did not gamble during the past 12 months. Also employees who did not primarily speak English within their homes, so there could have been a language issue going on here as well. The oriented group had larger proportions of employees who gambled during the past 12 months and those who primarily spoke English in their home. So moving forward, what do we take away from all of this? Down at the bottom, I'll say is probably one of the most important things to me, but I'll start with it and then I'll probably say it again because it's important. More program evaluation is needed for these types of training programs, and it's not just employee training. It's the statewide prevention programs, the intervention programs, the outreach programs. All of these need to have integrated into them evaluation, because unless they have that, we really don't know what's going on with them. Programs also should consider whether or not the training needs to be targeted. If you have these natural knowledge groups of employees who are coming in for orientation, you're running the risk of over and under training different groups of employees. And this could really turn people off to the whole idea of responsible gambling. If you have someone coming in and, you know, they've been there, done that, and I'm hearing the same thing over and over again, it's really easy for them to just kind of tune out. So think about what it means to kind of understand that different people are coming in from a different place. And then finally, some of these training programs really are going to have to try to focus on what it's going to take to correct gambling misconceptions. Because if you have an employee who's out there on the floor and they believe in the purple-haired troll that Leah's grandmother believed in, and they try to tell, you know, a patron that gaming machine is due to hit, that's a problem if you have an employee who's out there and they're holding on to these misconceptions. We need to take care of it. So, thank you very much.
And we do have time for comments or questions. So, well, that's going to give you an extra 5 minutes.
This time, I think I'll have good news about some different procedure. I think self-exclusion program is probably one of the programs we think when we talk about responsible gambling. I'll just say one word about why they are so important. The essential elements of regular or improved self-exclusion program, the evidence, empirical evidence on the benefits of improve, and you'll see what I mean by improve in a few minutes. And I'll suggest some elements that could be added in the different self-exclusion program. Among the pathological gamblers identified in prevalent study, few will seek formal treatment. And the figures we were discussing at lunch, what is the percentage of the problem gamblers or pathological gamblers that we identify in prevalent study that will seek professional treatment. My figure was 10% over a 3-year period, and that means about 3%. At lunch we were discussing 15%. I don't know if there's any recent data on this issue, but one thing for sure, we can take for granted that the majority of the people that we do identify in a given jurisdiction that are pathological gamblers will not seek professional help. In a way, there's some good news about it. Some will overcome their problem by themselves. So some will go to self-help group. But some, unfortunately, would need some professional help, but will not seek it. So in that context, the implication is that a variety of intervention need to be implemented, and self-exclusion programs are certainly among those interventions. We've conducted quite a few studies on the evaluation of self-exclusion, and I'll just give you an example of one of the studies we've done before we get to the improved self-exclusion program. We conducted that study in the Fort Casino in the province of Quebec in Canada, and one of the big questions, although it's not the main object of my presentation today, is what is the range of the self-exclusion period? Usually, the majority of the people will sign for a 1 year or 2 year self-exclusion. We strongly suggest that people will not sign for less than 1 year, but in the casino that I've worked with, we will accept any length. If someone wants to self-exclude for 3 months, we will not refuse it. And we we excluded lifetime self-exclusion for many reasons, and maybe Leah will say a word about the lifetime self-exclusion on her presentation. So roughly, it was from 6 months to self-exclusion period to 5 years. The main goal of the studies was to assess the change in gambling behavior and gambling problems of the people who signed for self-exclusion. And we followed the self-excluded patrons for 2 years. And here is the design. If you self-exclude for 6 months, as you can see in red, after 6 months, you're not a self-excluded patron anymore, but we will still evaluate those people at 6 months, 12 months, 18, and 24 months. People who sign for 12 months, the first year they will be self-excluded, but we will follow them after and see what how they behave. And the last group was 2 years, and we will follow them for the 3 years. We follow 161 individuals. It was their first self-exclusion contract or agreement. And each participant was contacted, like you could see in the previous slide, every 6 months for 2 years. The main finding is that the urge to gamble was significantly reduced when you signed for self-exclusion. The perception of control over your gambling activity was significantly increased, and the intensity of the negative consequences of gambling, such as daily activity, social life, work, and mood, was significantly improved. And what is quite interesting is the number of pathological gamblers, those who were, because people who sign for self-exclusion, the great majority are pathological gambler. When we followed them, they did not meet the criteria, and that was in the area of 25 to 30%. So that means it's a procedure which is quite useful. Another interesting, but maybe not in the coherence of the goal, we found that at 6, 12, and 24 months, about 40 to 50% had breached their contract at least once. So that means breaching is not an exceptional behavior among those people who self-exclude themselves. And one comment expressed by many self-excluded patrons is that they felt alone after they signed the contract. So what can we do about that? Well, in the self-exclusion program, in a paper that Alex Blazinski and Leon that we wrote, is how can we improve based on different and our experience and data, how can we improve self-exclusion? The usual procedure, the way it is conducted in the majority of jurisdictions that use self-exclusion is the gambler will ask an employee of the casino, very often is the security people. They meet with the employee in a private room. They sign the agreement, and they're on their own, and they will get back when the agreement or the length of the contract is over. A few observations. If the self-exclusion patron is identified in the venue, well, the operator will simply walk out the person. And our experience with the security people in the casino, they tell us that the great majority of people, once they are identified, they do not resist. They know, and they simply will walk away. I have known only one person in all our study that signed for self-exclusion on a preventive. And that was simply someone who was a business person. They had meetings at the casino. He was not a gambler. And they had those meetings, and he started playing blackjack, and he liked it. And he told us, you know, I was not really looking for our next meeting. I was looking for the location of our next meeting, because after the meeting, he would go and play blackjack. And he said, well, I better be careful about that. And he signed. But the majority are not doing it on the preventive aspect, but more because they have a problem with gambling. And also, we have introduced self-exclusion in VLT parlors in Quebec. And I think what you're discussing here in Mass, there will be the racinos, right? And that could be implemented too in such venues. What is the improved self-exclusion procedure? Well, when they request for self-exclusion, they meet with personnel at the casino, usually the security. Security in the agreement offers an initial meeting with an educator. We don't say here a therapist, but someone who's knowledgeable about gambling, and they will have a first meeting. And they will sign for a compulsory meeting at the end of the self-exclusion period. If they accept the initial meeting, they will have that meeting. I could tell you more what is the content. Essentially, there's a lot of information about gambling. We give them feedback about their gambling habits and the different negative consequences of gambling. And after that evaluation, different services are offered. Counseling, financial counselor, Gamblers Anonymous meeting that they can attend, legal advices, support through telephone support, and other kind of needs. Then, if they accept, they will have telephone support. At the end of the self-exclusion period, they will have this compulsory meeting with the educator. If they do not show up for that meeting, self-exclusion is still active. So they have to meet with the educator. And if they refuse the meeting, well, the initial meeting, they will still have the compulsory meeting at the end of the self-exclusion period. What are the key aspects of this procedure? There's a voluntary meeting at the beginning. If desired, telephone support is provided. And I'll just jump a little bit because of time on this aspect. Many ask for telephone support. That means we provide them with a telephone number of a counselor, and they can call whenever they want. If I would ask you, do they often call? They rarely call. But at the compulsory meeting at the end of the self-exclusion period, we asked them, why you didn't call? And the answer was simply, knowing that I could call anytime was a great, great, great security blanket for me. So that was offered, but they did not use it, but they, in a way, knowing that that was available was very important for them. Why this improved model? Simply to move away from the detection-based enforcement model to more of a personal involvement and responsibility. We did evaluate this program. There was the choice in the casino that if they did not want the improved program, they could have the regular program, the way I explained at the very beginning. Interestingly, 39% accepted, signed for the initial meeting, but 70% did not show up. 70% attended the mandatory final meeting. So that means 30% still have their self-exclusion contract active. The key findings. Well, over the 1-year follow-up, the results show that there was a significant decrease in the number of pathological gamblers among the people who self-exclude themselves. decrease in time and money spent gambling. It doesn't mean if you sign for self-exclusion that you will be abstinence of any form of gambling. The intensity of the negative consequences and the presence of depression and anxiety. The majority who attended the voluntary meeting find it quite useful. 97% of those who participate in the mandatory meeting at the end said it was quite useful. And what they most appreciated in all the procedure was the personal quality of the educator. That was the pivotal aspect of the, and interestingly, they did not rate the active ingredients that we taught were the most important ingredients at the meeting, but the personal competence and empathy of the educator. Some participants were reluctant to a mandatory meeting at the end. 18 emitted negative comments. They didn't like the aspect of being mandatory, as you may believe, and some said, well, it should not be compulsory. What are my suggestions about the self-exclusion? Well, one thing we should know is that, and this we all know now, I guess, the self-excluded individual is a very diversified and complex sample. And it's very difficult to conduct, studies in a casino. And some are very reluctant to participate in study. Based on our observation, probably one of the interesting avenues is to offer the buffet approach, which means that each patron could choose and comply to a set of the following options. They may decide that they want no additional measure. They just want to sign, go on, and for 1 year, 2 years, they don't want any contact. And I think we should respect that. Some would like to have an initial meeting. Roughly it was about an hour and a half meeting, 2 hours. A meeting at the end of the self-exclusion period. Telephone contact. Few periodic boosters during the self-exclusion period. And other measures that we can think of. So what I'm saying here is if we can offer different components, different activities, that would certainly be useful. But I just want to end with a few, maybe kind of some burning issues about self-exclusion. What should the operator do if the self-excluded patron breach? We know that 40 to 50% will breach at least once, and they win a big prize. I had the occasion to discuss that with a few of you during that meeting. Well, it seems clear from our knowledge and my clinical aspect on the self-exclusion, certainly the operator should not pay the winning to the self-excluded patron, simply because we'll be reinforcing breaching. Is it sufficient to implement the self-exclusion program? I would say no. I think we should evaluate. And I think that would have been said quite a few times over the day. We should evaluate and adjust the self-exclusion. And I could not stop myself bringing another issue. This is not on my slide that we discussed and I've heard today. Should we implement the procedure that a third party could exclude someone without his formal consent? I was discussing this issue in Singapore, that you may know that Singapore Casino introduced this component. They have no data, but my hypothesis was that, for example, if I would be a problem gambler, and my wife, for all kinds of reasons, will go to the casino and exclude me, I may not be able to go back, and that may be helpful for my gambling problem, but one thing for sure, it will increase my marital problem. So I think we have to be careful about, like I've said before, common wisdom, what we think is good, may not be necessarily supported by empirical evidence. Thank you very much.
You guys are getting some exercise in swinging your heads from side to side. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, and I want to say before I start, and I have this at the end of my slide, but in case I don't emphasize this enough, Joe Kelly from SUNY Buffalo, I got this topic at 9 a.m. Friday morning, and had to get all this legal research, which I would never have been able to do without him on a Saturday, emailing me reams of articles and cases, and so I just want to say he's an enormous help. So what I'm going to talk about today is, and those of you that know me know that I'm also an attorney, a former criminal prosecutor, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues in self-exclusion and some things like if a state's going to craft an optimal program, what are some of the components that really should be in there, not from a conceptual level, but from sort of a liability limiting perspective. So we know that these self-exclusion programs vary significantly by jurisdiction. And litigation surrounding these programs, at least in the US and Canada, has largely resulted in dismissals or settlements. So there have been some, what somebody would term a successful case, but they've been sealed. And we don't know, we know which one's sort of settled, but we don't know for how much. So what I'm going to do is review the legal issues in select published cases. Most of you are probably aware of the ones I'm going to talk about. There are some fun ones like handing bags of cash over in the Sydney casino, which I won't touch on, but that one was settled. And suggest areas for future consideration, posit suggestions for the development of a comprehensive liability-minded self-exclusion program. Next slide. So here's some possible causes of action. The way that this has sort of been outlined, and it's interesting, there's been some interest in the law journals in this area, students sort of chewing on some of these issues, and basically these cases have sort of turned around a few different causes of action. Accidental conduct. So one of the defenses sort of has been if there was any harm, which we're not saying there was any harm, but it was not reasonably foreseeable. And the research has established that a disproportionate, or has shown that a disproportionate amount of gambling revenues comes from problem gamblers. So the casinos sort of have to establish that they can identify individual problem gamblers. And I would disagree with my esteemed colleague from MIT about these player tracking algorithms. There's no transparency in how they were developed. There's no outside empirical testing of them, and they make a lot of money off these, and the rest of us aren't able to do, Howard's nodding, aren't able to do any research on them to prove whether they're valid or invalid. So I would disagree that in any way people should take those algorithms as something we should use. The accidental conduct, the casinos, if a problem gambler, that you can't take reasonable steps to prevent a pathological gambler from harming themselves. And those of you that either know some or have them in your lives know that irrespective of everything else, if they want to continue to do something, they will. When Missouri had the $500 loss limits, all they would do is just go to a different casino, or they would get cards under different IDs or something like that. It didn't deter people who really wanted to gamble problematically. So possible causes of action, intentional misconduct. So knowing with substantial certainty that the consequences of their actions, like intentional direct marketing, credit, other enticements to the self-excluded person. So that's something that once the person self-excludes, then if they start to get these marketing, that's been an area where there have been suits. They keep getting marketing materials. It's usually accidental, which is the defense, but you know, the person suing says, no, it's not. They know they want me to come back. Negligence, they should have reasonably foreseen harm and avoided conduct that led to harm. Is the operator under a legal duty to exclude or otherwise respond to those who exhibit characteristics of problem gambling? And if we're in the Netherlands, we would say yes. We're going to approach them and say, you have been gambling too much. But if we're here in the United States, we value our privacy, and typically that's not been the case. So the underlying analogy in most of these cases that have come up have been intoxication. A sort of dram shop for gambling argument. So most jurisdictions don't allow intoxicated patrons who have suffered injury to recover from a bar unless the bartender or waitress served an obviously intoxicated person or the injury was to a third party. So the courts have reasoned since a drinker can't recover from a bar that served them, a gambler shouldn't recover from a casino who let them gamble. If the damage is, just to themselves, or there's not a sort of approximate cause of the actual trip to the casino. And the alcohol cases really do turn on proximate cause. So what they'll say is the proximate cause is the liquor, not the bartender. So unless this bartender knew that this person was already drunk and gave them the alcohol and then they went out and hurt someone else, you can't recover. However, with gambling, this particular author, Bauer, in this one law journal, Northern Illinois University Law Review, argued that the harm could be seen to occur the moment the gambler is fed the dangerous substance, which is gambling. So you have to sort of believe that the activity is inherently nefarious, not that it's the excess of the person. And if the person's self-excluded, the harm is foreseeable, which I think is a stronger argument. If the person's self-excluded and you continue to market to them, there is a potential for incurring some liability. However, unlike with alcohol, there's no law expressly prohibiting casino operators from permitting disordered gamblers to gamble. And there's no express rights of action or other civil remedies to provide disordered gamblers or persons affected by them. And if anybody who knows a lot about the tax and the domestic laws, I mean, there's nothing really to protect the creditors from going after a spouse if the gambler uses their credit card or any kind of, or if the ATM card or whatever, and you use it for gambling debts, the spouse is equally severally liable for those debts. So we just have sort of a different system here. So a few cases I just want to go over quickly. Now first one will just sort of show you the difference. You can put the whole thing up there. The difference between the U.S. and Canada and Austria. This Christian Hans, who was a problem gambler, he visited 2 Austrian casinos more than 100 times between 1997 and 2000, and the court said the casino was guilty of gross malfeasance and negligent behavior by not restricting someone who exhibited all the signs of pathological gambling, and ordered the casino to reimburse about $680,000, which was only 20% of his losses. So in contrast to that, the Joe McNeely case, some of you may know he was a Louisiana college football star, and he died recently, I think. He sued 4 Louisiana casinos federally. And his lawyer had contacted the casinos, informed them that he was a disordered gambler, and asked them not to contact him, let him gamble, or obtain credit. And the consideration for that, the lawyer said, was that we're going to tell everyone that you're a great, you're good people, you honorable people. That was the consideration for the quote contract that was alleged. There was no self-exclusion initiated, and only one casino honored the request, and the file is sealed. The word is that there was some type of settlement, but we don't know because it was sealed. Okay, next one. Tavares versus Resorts International Hotel. Some of you may have met Tavares. She's something. In 2007, this Aurelia Tavares, who was a former New York attorney, lost $150,000 in one weekend, and she sued 6 New Jersey casinos for $20 million, alleging breach of a duty of care after she identified as a problem gambler. She also sued under RICO, that the casinos collaborated to lure her out of New Jersey to gamble outside New Jersey. And they dismissed her suit because of no duty of care on the casinos, and she didn't plead mail fraud on the federal charge. So that was dismissed. And then Merrill versus Trump, Indiana. Indiana had a bad run. They had a few of these. So this Mark Merrill, he was a problem gambler, and the clinic contacted the casino as, quote, guardian, custodian, trustee to inform them to enter an oral contract to bar him. The gambler himself also wrote the casino and asked for self-exclusion. Now, there wasn't a formal process there until 2000, so he couldn't actually go through the self-exclusion process. In '98, he returns to gamble. He's not barred. He loses. He robs banks. He goes to federal prison. And the court granted a summary judgment for the casino, and they said they owed no duty of care to him because the regulation was not in effect, and it didn't contemplate a private cause of action, civil liability, only fines. So I'm going to mention that later, but that is important, how you craft what you write. And then I think this is the last one. Yeah, the Williams case. This is another Indiana case. This David Williams, who I think worked for the Department of Revenue for the state of Indiana, he was a former auditor. He gambled at Casino Astar in Evansville. And his girlfriend, so this is sort of, I put this in here because it's a third party when you're talking about contemplating third party intervention. His girlfriend repeatedly contacted state officials and the casino for intervention. After reporting he was contemplating suicide, Astar's responsible gaming committee approached Williams. He sought help and was committed for suicidality. Astar sent a cease admissions letter, and he'd gambled away about $160,000 since between his girlfriend's first call and this cease admissions letter. He was abstinent for a year, and then, as we know happens, he returned to the casino and gambled until he was identified, losing an additional $15,000 to $20,000. He sued under RICO, but he actually alleged mail fraud. He said the promotional materials the casino was sending him constituted mail fraud, and this was dismissed as frivolous, and the judge was spared him no dignity in dismissing this case. So I want to briefly touch on FinCEN. Probably most of you know about FinCEN, and I do think there is some potential relevance of FinCEN on this whole self-exclusion discussion. FinCEN has really ramped up investigations for alleged violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. And those of you, it's U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And recently, the Sands Corp, which owns Venetian and Palazzo, they had a $47.4 million settlement with the Justice Department for failing to identify $58 million in suspicious transactions. And the claim was that they failed to flag about $45 million in wire transfers and $13 million in cashier's check deposits between February 2005 and March 2007 by this Chinese national accused of trafficking narcotics. And then another really recent case that all of you will be very familiar with is the investigation of Caesars, MGM, Wynn for alleged anti-money laundering violations. They're accused of failing to document the exchange of millions in foreign currency by high-rolling clients from China, Japan, and Russia. And the money was flown to casino on planes, and client arrived with less than $10,000, which is what triggers FinCEN. I took that out. Never mind. I almost mentioned something I took out. If the government can impose so the question becomes, if the government can impose a heightened duty to identify these violations, which is what's going on, that then puts a higher duty on the casinos to track these players' financial transactions, spending, et cetera, which then means can't regulators then require the same diligence with regard to self-excluded persons? And this is where I think there's a really new wrinkle in this whole discussion. Go ahead. So the primary issues in self-exclusion, the state regulations say licensees must maintain a list and submit internal control procedures, but this is usually vague, doesn't require the use of facial recognition software, which we know is not as great as the layperson really thinks it is, license plate monitoring or other specific procedures. The sanctions may or may not be imposed for violations, and if imposed, the sanctions may only be levied for those who are caught versus those who should have been caught. And the casinos are permitted to keep the winnings, but or that they donate the winnings, it depends on the legislation, but not required to return the losses. So these are some considerations. I heard one person say, if the same diligence were applied to catch these self-excluders in the casino as applied to the advantaged players who win at blackjack, a lot more of them would be identified. So that's one argument that's sort of been levied. So if we look at the lawsuits, the basis for these lawsuits are, it's perceived as a win-win for the casinos, that there's no incentive to identify these people unless they're winning. So there's sort of an unjust enrichment legal argument that's been put forward, and that the responsibility is only on the patron despite a perceived contract. Now, we may argue there is no contract. This is a barrier method. It's not a contract, but the basis for a lot of these lawsuits has been that there is a contract. I agree to stay out, you agree to keep me out, and there is some people who believe that the casino should have to return anything that patron lost as a result of them not, or put it into a fund, as a result of not being identified, the same as the patron doesn't get to keep the winnings. So here's what I'm just going to give you, considerations for self-exclusion. So if we look at Missouri, how am I doing on time, Jeff? Okay? Okay. I tend to talk fast, but every once in a while. So the need for a centralized system, I understand you all are going to have a centralized system. I come from Missouri that has a centralized system. I think that's the optimal system. New Jersey is a nightmare, where I live now. So in Missouri, the self-exclusion is run by the Missouri Gaming Commission through agents that work with the casinos. In New Jersey, it's just a patchwork. Some have good programs, some have no programs. The state has a program, but you have to drive to one of two offices. There's no coordination. It might as well not, and the racetracks, forget it. I've actually gone with a problem gambler who's on the self-excluded list to the racetrack while they played and while they cashed out, and no one ever asked them for anything. There's only 100 people on the list. How hard can that be? But there's no incentive for the racetracks to catch these people. So self-exclusion should be state-run, utilizing a centralized register that imposes uniform registration, identification, and breach procedures. That's sort of my own personal belief on it. And then general considerations, next one. You need to think about, like, how long should the ban last? I mean, Missouri had a lifetime ban. And the pros of it were that, basically most of us that are clinicians feel that once a person's a disordered gambler, like, let them do something else. Why dangle the cookie in front of the Weight Watchers person or whatever? But, and I go to Weight Watchers. I don't do so well. Anybody who sat with me at lunch would know that, right, Rachel? I had 2 of those little cupcake things. Anyway, once a disordered gambler, might as well just stay out for life. But the cons are, what we found in Missouri was it's an enforcement nightmare. People move, they change their names, they die, and the list just grows unmanageable, and you're trying to police all of these people, and it's just impossible. So under what circumstances can a person revoke their ban at will after finishing some intervention, counselor certification, what's the minimum amount of time, and what's the role of third parties? I mean, this third party provision is a worry. I had the same worry when Missouri had the identification monitor that was monitored by Equifax. Because if I were a divorce lawyer or someone suing someone, I would say, whoa, or someone doing credit ratings, I would try to get that data to somehow alter this, to use in court. And in this situation, if any third party in a domestic dispute can go in and exclude someone and then use that evidence to say, well, they're a problem gambler, therefore they squandered it. I mean, you're getting yourself into the middle of something that may be really dangerous. And I think we're on the next one. So some considerations for the operator: are there checking requirements, mandatory promotion of the program, how visible does it have to be, an ID system requirement, like digital pictures. One of these lawsuits, they said, well, the state only gives us actual pictures, not digital, so we can't use facial recognition. So something to think about. Penalties for both the gambler and the venue upon violation of the program. Training of casino employees, requiring operators to remove self-excluders for marketing lists, and there have to be penalties. If people don't have penalties, there's not a lot of incentive. So now the last thing I just want to go over real quickly is what do I think, if I were writing a contract for self-exclusion, what are the essential components of a self-exclusion agreement? The gambler certifies that they are a disordered gambler and they want a self-ban. You don't have to know whether they are or they aren't. They're certifying they are. Gambler agrees that the casino has no independent knowledge of the truth of that claim. The casino agrees to allow the patron to self-exclude and to remove the patron or have them arrested for trespass. I mean, if that's your provision. I'm just doing this as an example. In the event the gambler is found on the premises, the gambler understands that returning to the premises constitutes a material breach. I think that's important because some of these cases have turned on who's breaching. The casino by not catching the person or the person by going back. So, and then what was genius in the Missouri thing that Kevin Mullally drafted that I thought was really, really a brilliant thing was the gambler agrees to notify the casino within 24 hours of the breach. Now, no gamblers do this, so they're double breaching. So if they bring a cause of action against the state or the casinos, it's going to be doubly difficult for them to even have a cause of action. The gambler agrees that his or her failure to comply with this voluntary ban may result in trespass, arrest, prosecution, whatever you choose to put in. The gambler agrees that the winnings will be forfeited. The gambler understands that forfeited winnings will be donated to or whatever you're going to do with them. I think they're going into a fund here or something like that. The casino agrees that any losses, I personally would also make the casinos give the losses between the time of ban to a fund. To make it look like there's at least a little bit of an investment. The casino agrees that any losses incurred by a self-excluded gambler following the ban will be donated to whoever. The gambler releases and forever discharges, blah, 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 lawyer language. So thanks again to Joe Kelly. He was a lifesaver.
Great. You learned that in New Jersey.
Yeah, they talk slower in Missouri.
I will not talk nearly that fast, and I consider myself a fast talker. First, let me just say a little bit about the third-party exclusion. Not a whole lot is clarified in the statute as it relates to that, other than that it is managed through the courts, and so it's not as if someone can just sign you up for third-party exclusion. So they have put some pieces in there, and you know, Mark and I have discussed that a little bit in terms of needing to do a fair amount of work as it relates to, I mean, at this point, I don't know that the courts would have any idea what to do with someone who showed up and wanted to offer a third-party exclusion for a family member. Who's going to evaluate that, and what's that criteria going to look like? I think there are a lot of important considerations there, so I just wanted to say that piece. So I was lucky enough to be assigned the topic for which there is absolutely no research. So you've heard from all these fantastic researchers, and Mark gave me a topic for which there's really nothing to go on, other than a lot of great discussions. This is really a Canadian model in terms of looking at, you know, and I put it in quotations marks all the time, which is on-site treatment or on-site clinical centers. It's something that the drafters of the legislation, you know, took some time to really go and take a look at and evaluate how it's being done, and there isn't kind of one specific way to do it. And so I would say, you know, I spend a lot of my time, I work with a lot of key stakeholders, but spend a lot of time working with industry members. And so this Mass Partnership on Responsible Gambling, we spend an entire day, primarily most of the day, talking about these centers. This is what the casino bidders are really concerned about in terms of how to write their that portion of their bids. So I'm glad we're having a moment to discuss this. I'm going to skip over this slide actually because I talked about it this morning, and I'd like to just keep going there. So, you know, one of the things I did say to folks this morning, and is typical of forums like this, is oftentimes there's more questions than answers. This is absolutely 12 minutes of questions. And I think it's because there are just so many different considerations. You know, in terms of the way that Howard laid out his presentation today, this is absolutely a place where the Gaming Commission and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts gets to decide what are the values we want to put into an opportunity like this. It's not really being done anywhere else. What are the values we want to place on offering something like this? And then what are the strategies and tactics that we want to impart through this product? So a great opportunity for us. So again, lots of questions. Defining what takes place at this on-site center, who runs the on-site center, where should they be located? That has been, I can't tell you how much discussion just that has been, which is the gaming industry folks saying, should it be in the middle of the casino? Should it be at the edge of the casino? who should be staffing it should be near where the gaming commissioners who are going to be on site at the casino should be near them? Should the gaming commissioners be really far from that? You know, kind of who should be in eyesight of it? Lots of considerations about that. And really, what should be named? I mean, just when Mark and I talk about it, we can't come up with a common language. I've been joking because I've been calling the BIC centers, which he keeps telling me is not going to stick, but it's the brief intervention centers, and it's simply because we know everyone's aware of the fact that it's not going to be treatment, right? I think there's a pretty common consensus that people aren't going to show up at a casino for treatment. I don't know, maybe we could change that discussion, but that's been the ongoing dialogue for us. And kind of who is it for? That's another big consideration. Certainly, the intention, I think, is that it's for patrons who have experienced a problem with gambling. But as we've talked about today, there are so many different ways for us to consider some of these strategies and tactics. We could think about it being more on a preventative end versus intervention and treatment end. And what does that look like, and how do we craft that? You know, the number one most frustrating call to receive on a helpline is from a family member whose loved one is at the casino, has been there for days upon days, and they can't get them out. And you talk to industry members who also say that that's a really frustrating phone call because they don't know what to do with the family members. There must be a place to help family members. This might be that place. There might be an opportunity for family members who may not be able, because again, it's that individual's right to be there gambling, may not be able to extract their loved one, but maybe they then can access some resources. So there might be an opportunity for some type of intervention and help there. And then employees. As you've heard a number of people refer to today, there are higher rates of gambling disorders among employees. Where are they accessing resources? Are they accessing it through HR? Are they accessing it through an EAP? Or might they use some version of the center in the front side and the back end? You know, what is happening in that center for those employees? Is the setup the same for each of these groups? Like I said, is there a front side, a back side? And can the space be partitioned in some way? Is it staffed 24 hours a day? You know, this is an ongoing dialogue for helplines. This is ongoing dialogue as it relates to treatment. And certainly this would be a dialogue for these centers. You know, and if it is, how are you going to get traffic in there? How are you going to find a purpose for that person 24 hours a day? And can terminals play some role in this? Does it have to be staffed by a person? Is there some role for the terminals inside the center versus outside the center? There are a lot of different implications there as well. Next slide. So, you know, I think the other piece is that these should not be isolated. They should be part of a system. And, you know, I described a little bit about the systems we currently have in Massachusetts and some of the systems we'd like to have in Massachusetts. Lots of folks want to interact with these. So looking at how prevention services interact with these on-site centers, intervention systems and resources, and certainly treatment efforts. I'd say that the treatment efforts are, you know, the treatment providers currently are the ones that are most interested in what is going to be happening with these on-site centers. Looking at crisis teams. You know, certainly casinos who operate in other jurisdictions know what to do if someone says they're suicidal. But do they have an idea of, you know, someone who's talking a little bit about suicide ideation but don't have a plan? You know, who are those crisis teams that are interacting? And what is the training of that employee who is on site? The local hospitals, what do they know about problem gambling and how do they react with these centers? Outpatient treatment centers, you know, what we'd love to see is how does someone who might have some interaction there, whether it be a screen or some resources, are they connected enough that they can then immediately be assigned an appointment at a local treatment center, and that way they don't have to make that separate phone call, because we all know that if they have to make that separate phone call, it's not going to happen. So that warm transfer, or that idea that they can immediately insert someone, very much the NIATEX model. Schools, correctional facilities, legal services, all those different services that are happening and need to be happening in tandem. Who's coordinating that, and how are those staying together? Also, the ideas in terms of, you know, how are they managed, how are they paid, you know, and if these folks are at all involved in the self-exclusion programs, how's that happening? Could anyone looking for help walk in and do what they need to do, or do they need to be somehow connected to the facility? Do they need to have a player's card? Do they need to be a known quantity? You know, for me, I'm not forgetting that I'm serving a whole lot of folks who currently are dealing with gambling disorders, and casinos aren't here in Massachusetts yet. But a lot of those folks are, you know, going to arrive at those casinos. So how do we connect all the various services that are out there? And if folks may want to stay away from the casinos, or maybe they, you know, some folks will talk about getting the rush just by walking up to the front door before they've ever placed a bet, wagered. What if they were able to step into there first before they made that decision to bet? So how can they connect, you know, how can these on-site centers connect the services that are happening outside and inside, and do they need to know this person as a known quantity? Next slide. Data, you know, you've heard time and time and time again today about data. This is a really key piece. So because our statewide, our system is so connected in terms of those 3 casinos and that slot parlor, it's so important to have data. So let's not fool ourselves. The person who goes to the one in Region A is very likely to also go to the one in Region B and Region C. So if they've given some information here, or at some point decided that, you know, there's only certain points of intervention sometimes in this cycle of addiction, and so if there's an opportunity to have kept some of the information about that individual, do we want that? Do we want to have personalized data? Do we want to just be collecting data in terms of evaluation of these centers? How far do we want to go? Obviously, we don't want to be violating HIPAA laws. On the other hand, is there some type of tracking data that will be useful to the individuals? And I talked a little about, you know, can all the data information be kept separate from personal identifying information? And then similarly, what I talked about earlier in terms of self-exclusion, and if self-exclusion, you know, do we have some type of a certifying program where we know that a number of folks in the casino and outside the casino can help folks to get on, help patrons to get onto that self-exclusion list? Can the people in the center maybe be the ones that do that certifying, that are certifying people that show up at that ER, that show up through the crisis team, that are showing up at the outpatient treatment centers, as well as on-site? You know, why not coordinate that if we're going to be doing a statewide exclusion program? Next slide. And this is just kind of my lasting thing, and Mark's heard me talk about this as well, which is, you know, attraction and not promotion. This is an idea that I recently saw on idealist.org, and this is a place where they have a barbershop and for people who need legal advice. And so you go in under the auspices that you are getting a haircut, but there's a lawyer offering free advice in the back, a certified lawyer, you know, like a real lawyer. And the idea is that you don't have to feel ridiculous or feel, somehow delinquent if you need help, that you are feeling like you're just any other patron at a barbershop. And I wonder if there's some way for us to set up some type of opportunity for people to feel, you know, I find it hard to imagine if I need help that I'm going to walk into a place and say, hey, you that I don't know, I'm going to admit that unlike the thousands of people that are out there gambling, I can't control my gambling. That is a really hard thing for people to do, to pick up the phone, and I think would be even harder to show up in person. But is there some way for us to sell these centers that is under the auspices of something else a little more, you know, normalized, that at least brings them in the door and makes them feel a little more comfortable, and then they can really access some help, however we decide to do that. And that's it. Thank you.
Our last panelist, Dr. Bulbert. And we've done very good keeping on schedule. We're only 5 minutes behind. And what I'd like to do is give you that 5 minutes and just take 5 minutes out of our break.
I knew I only had 5 minutes, which is why I didn't prepare any slides. I prepared slides, but didn't give them to the person who's in charge of slides. I'd like to thank the commission for inviting me to speak, or Mark and Jeff. This is the end of a very lengthy session, I have to say, and I'm sure you've all been pounded into submission. So thank you for sitting for a few more minutes. I just want to actually make one small comment to speaking to the topic that Marlene just finished up on, because like a number of us here, I had the salutary experience of going to Singapore and having a tour of the casinos. And I actually was with a group that wanted to see the rooms where help would be provided to people who, you know, sought somebody out and asked for help. And we were all completely appalled, actually, when one of the casinos, I won't say which one, proudly led us to a space that they had set aside for people who needed help with the gambling problem. And it was actually 2 chairs with a little table next to them, or between them, that was situated in the locker room for the casino staff. I was like, oh, I don't think this space is going to work very well for this purpose. I might want to think about it. So I think, you know, that sort of speaks to me to the importance of careful consideration in terms of implementation of many of these responsible gambling ideas that we have. So we've given you lots of ideas, but I think there's a lot of work to be done by many of the stakeholders to think about how it's actually going to be implemented. So I'm going to actually just talk a little bit about, I've been asked to talk about evaluating responsible gambling programs. As you may have guessed by now, there's relatively little to tell you about. So I think I'm going to talk about what might be possible. A couple of years ago, I was asked to speak at a conference about building a robust responsible gambling program. And I started out that talk by comparing 2 quotes. And I'd like to put on my glasses and read them for you. So one is a quote actually from the Reno Model article, the 2008 piece by Alex Blazinski and others, where they actually state that individuals retain the ultimate responsibility to make responsible gambling choices. They frame that as you know, the industry and government and the community have to ensure that there's adequate information, but it's ultimately up to the individual to decide. Comparing that with a quote from Gerda Reith, who some of you may have heard about or run across her work, where she argues from a very sort of sociological position that in the case of gambling, the liberalization and deregulation of the industry and the simultaneous expectation that individual players govern themselves express the tensions inherent in consumer capitalism. And so those are very theoretical remarks, but for me they sort of frame the essential tension when we're thinking about responsible gambling as, you know, is it the ultimate decision of the individual to act responsibly, or is it the ultimate decision of government and operators and the communities of various kinds and many stakeholders to sort of provide a safety net, if you will, and to try to build a structure in place that will save people from falling off the cliff and getting into the arms of the ambulance. So you've heard a great deal about many, many different possible programs that have been implemented over actually not a particularly long period of time. You've heard about public and player education and signage and ethical codes of advertising. You've certainly heard a lot about self-exclusion and exclusion programs, pre-commitment, environmental and machine design modifications, policies with regard to alcohol service and access to cash, improved referrals to treatment services, and closer liaisons with treatment service providers. So there's a lot of possible tools and possible approaches out there. But the question that we keep asking is, you know, are these effective? And you've heard once again that there are literally hundreds of studies out there, but only about 10% of them, or even less, actually speak to the data and actually provide useful information in terms of the effectiveness of any of these measures. And I have to say that's a bit disappointing, I'm sure, for all of you to hear on the commission, but hopefully in Massachusetts we have plenty of researchers and plenty of goodwill, and I think that the opportunity is here to build an evaluation of all of the measures that we take that hopefully will not only inform us here in the Commonwealth, but will also inform people in many other jurisdictions. So you've heard that there are very few initiatives that have been systematically evaluated, that responsible gambling measures are often introduced without evidence of their effectiveness. Always a surprise to many people. Really, they didn't evaluate it before they decided that it would be a good thing to do, but it's what the guy in the next state over was doing, and so it must be great because they decided to do it, not knowing that that guy decided to do it because the guy before him decided to do it, and the guy before him thought it seemed like a good idea, or had a good drinking buddy that thought it was a good idea. And there certainly are concerns that implementing some of these responsible gambling measures will negatively affect non-problem gamblers. So I guess the good news, if there's good news, there's always good news. The good news is that there actually are a growing number of certification and accreditation schemes that are out there. eCobra, the World Lottery Association, what else do I have here? The Responsible Gambling Check, which is the Ontario approach. I know there's quite a number of others. And so the recent emergence of these sort of certification efforts really speaks to the need and the desire for such systems. So, so show us that you're being effective, meet these criteria, demonstrate that you're doing what we want you to do to be responsible purveyors of this product. So that's the good news. The bad news is that, unfortunately, all of these recent certification efforts have limitations that really hinder their goal of helping to prevent problem gambling. So there are a number of these limitations that are of particular concern to many of us. There are clearly some conflicts of interest and a lack of independence of many of these certification efforts. There is, in my opinion, really insufficient transparency about what these certification bodies are requiring and how they are assessing whether people are meeting those requirements. The existing standards, and this goes back to the work of the invisible person in this room, I've come to realize is Rob Williams, once again. The literature review that he and Bev West and Rob Simpson did, which looked at all of the different responsible gambling or problem gambling prevention programs and basically rated them in terms of the evidence base, but also whether they were relatively weak or relatively strong in terms of their ability to prevent problem gambling. And Rob points out, or he and his colleagues point out in their report, that the existing standards that are implemented actually emphasize some of the more of the relatively weak strategies and don't sort of put a foot down in terms of strategies that probably based on not just gambling evidence but alcohol and drug evidence probably would be more effective. And so my sort of final point here is that there is an overriding challenge facing all of us when we think about responsible gambling, which is that for truly effective responsible gambling initiatives, those effective initiatives are inevitably going to conflict directly with the ability to maximize gambling profits. And so you're going to have to take, you know, the really good measures that are going to be effective with the understanding that you are not going to generate the same level of profits as if you let the industry go ahead. And I think that's really a fundamental dilemma that we have to deal with going forward. So I think this is my final slide. Yes. In terms of responsible gambling and regulation, it seems to me that transparent and inclusive consultation processes prior to the implementation of responsible gambling strategies or you know, programs are growing and are needed. But enforcement really depends on regular assessments of responsible gambling measures, and along with that, I would say specific metrics of performance. We have to start thinking about how we're going to measure these programs, and you know, whose feet are we going to hold to the fire when it turns out that they're not meeting the metrics that we set for them. The assessments need to be published. They need to be made public. And this commission has front and center placed transparency. And I would say that this is a place where responsible gambling measures have not met the mark internationally, is that many of the measures that have been undertaken, there's no evidence because there's reports that got buried in a government agency somewhere. So publication is essential, peer review is essential. I would say that the data should be made available to other researchers beyond the evaluation or audit teams. Never hurts to have somebody else check your work. And there are clearly procedures that are needed for funding and commissioning that kind of evaluation research, because it's not something that's just going to happen all by itself. I got a couple minutes? Okay, it was not my final slide, it was my next to final slide. So in conclusion, there is widespread agreement that responsible gambling should be a fundamental principle guiding gambling industry and regulatory practice. I think you've seen that today, and you've heard from many people that subscribe to that from many different perspectives. You've also learned that there's very little consensus as yet about how responsible gambling should be defined or what measures are most effective. There is a need for good feedback systems, and there's disclosure needed to generate data so that all of the stakeholders can assess the performance of the measures that are put in place. You've heard me say this before. And so in conclusion, I'll take the researcher's mantra and tell you that more research is needed. Thank you.
With that, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel one more time. And I thank all of you for enduring that very long session. And your reward is a break. So we'll reconvene at, let's see, we have 4 o'clock.
Try to get some more clarification, to stimulate a discussion between our panelists, the speakers this morning, and our commissioners, and the audience if there are points that people would like to make. Before we kick it off, I know that Chairman Crosby had a few questions that he wanted to ask specifically, or statements.
Well, yeah, I just thank you, Mark. I'm going to have to leave in a couple of minutes, and I just wanted to get a couple of things out on the table and a question. I mean, it's been incredibly overwhelming. It's, you know, one of those drinking from the fire hose type things. You just get so much stuff, and it's tremendously interesting, tremendously provocative. I now understand the quote that I read at the beginning, which is, we have to go off and make decisions with remarkably little real hard data. And I did say, when I introduced my introductory remarks, that, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We do have common sense, and to a certain extent, this isn't rocket science, and yet, time after time, I saw that my commonsensical reaction, like, for example, to the pre-commitment stuff, I said, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. That sounds like something we could, so there's not that much research, we could go right down that road. And then along comes his, his data, and he suggests not clear that how effective that is at all. So I'm not sure that it is a matter of common sense. So I'm infinitely struck by both the need for, but also the opportunity that we continue to have. We do have this legislative mandate, which pretty much encompasses every aspect of possible areas to research. And I hope all of you will contribute your thoughts. If you've got ideas about things we need to do, we do have this ability to put resources to bear on any of these other issues. So I'm struck by, in addition to the really robust baseline survey that we've got going underway and additional dimensions that are going to be underway, that there's a whole lot more that we need to do. And I think we really need to make sure we don't miss anything. Having said all that, what I would be interested in is just reflections from you all about, how do we realistically come up with a sort of suite of best practice strategies from all this stuff? We have to put something into regs and create an operational system, starting sometime maybe possibly as soon as beginning of, to be operational as middle of next year. And certainly we need to have the operators know how their system's going to gear up, and if there's anything to do with machines, that takes lead time. So we don't have a lot of time. How would you all recommend this be synthesized and turned into a framework of thoughtful, comprehensive best practices?
I'll take a shot. From my perspective, I do think one of the most important aspects is partnership. And I think this is an industry, this is a field where we cannot be afraid to work with industry advocates and regulators in a kind of a tripartite concept. I think that there's a lot to be learned from what they've done voluntarily. And then I think that the best model is going to be a regulatory voluntary model, that some of this, you work towards the goal of having good, responsible gaming, and that the operators may well have some very good thoughts about where to start from, but it's an iterative, it's an evolutionary process. I suspect you wouldn't be able to design a full suite of absolutely everything best practice from the get-go, but that I think very much, especially with the research loop, evaluation loop built into it, that you can start from and lean on the industry's experience in a lot of these areas, these defined areas, and work towards best practice. That's my 2 cents. It doesn't have to be totally top-down regulatory driven.
Yeah.
If I might just suggest one thought, playing off what Keith suggested, I think there is, having a blank sheet of paper is always sort of intoxicating, and that is not necessarily what's there. There's a lot of experience to draw off of, and there are some interesting ideas out there. Some turn out to have possibly counterintuitive outcomes, but an incremental approach, as opposed to thinking, well, we're going to, as Keith said, we're going to nail it this time, we're just going to get them all, may be dangerous, because then you're actually not going to be able to evaluate what you've done and what the responses are and what the outcomes are. And an incremental approach, more where you maybe look at opportunities and pick one to think, well, that might be worth trying. Let's see how that works. And then give yourself a chance. You have this mandate to evaluate, to figure out if it does. And, I don't mean to overplay this point, but it's not a catastrophe out there. We have people with gambling problems. It hasn't gotten worse. So we need to work on it. We need to get better at it, and in a way that we can keep track of and make sense out of. That's all.
I have a 4-year-old, and she likes to play with these things that snap together in little constellations. And that's sort of how I like to deal with these policy issues. So I think, like Mark has done a great job of outlining which issues we talk about here. I think as a commission, you pick like, okay, this issue, let's make some decisions about this. And then you have, we have all the research. South Australia's had a lot of regulations. There's a lot of places. And we look at what's actually been empirically tested and found to say, well, yes, this seems, there's some basis for this. And you have a stepped-in approach where you get a work group together, you look at all the different things that have been tested with regard to this area, then you say, we're going to try 1, 2, and 3, because those have an empirical basis, and we're going to follow the results of these things. And then 4, 5, and 6 have differing things. If this isn't enough, then we'll come back and we'll look at these things later. And then you move on to the next area, and you start to build a framework, and then you can step things in later once it's all connected.
Well, I guess I wouldn't be an advocate for programs for problem gamblers if I didn't say that. I mean, I think David's absolutely right. The evidence does not seem to have been a massive increase, but certainly I think even under the adaptation model, there's a spike after gambling is introduced. And I think we'd be remiss not to say, even if in all the previous cases the spike seems to have leveled off, the rate still seems to be trending upwards, and there is that spike we have to deal with. So I think, and no one knows what Massachusetts experience will be. I mean, there's nothing to lead us to assume that that will be the case here. I mean, we can, correlation, causation, and all that. So, I mean, but I think you're right. In general, this is within the same range, but we shouldn't be that sanguine. And I know you weren't saying that there's no need for this, but I do think we have to acknowledge this is still untested, and it's, you're going to have to live through this, and that if there is a spike, even a minor one, the state the size of Massachusetts, that's a fairly large number of people whose lives are going to be damaged to some lesser or massively greater extent.
Can I make a comment which I think may speak to a concern that I've heard a number of members of the commission express, which is, if you only get one bite at the apple of getting responsible gambling right. And I think that there's certainly the biggest bite of the apple that you can take at the beginning, but the point that Keith made about an iterative process, and Howard made the same point, and I think a couple of other people have as well, is that I think we can put responsible gambling measures in place that are are supported by the research evidence, but then we also need to think about what do we want to put in that may not be supported by the evidence, but we think are common sense ideas, and then have the evaluation sort of roll out and give us some data, and then craft a revised set of measures. And so I think as regulators, you sort of have to think about you get bite 1, and then maybe bite 2 is smaller, but it's still a bite.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point, and that that is compatible, I think, with what everybody was saying, and that gives an easier task to Mark and the team too. You don't have to do everything all at once, and we don't have to be overwhelmed with anxiety that we can't get everything done at once. But to be thoughtful and incremental, appropriately incremental about it. I think that's a constructive thought. This has been a really phenomenal event. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
I thought Howard's discussion of using the principles of bioethics in terms of how to take a look at this made a lot of sense as well. And it is much easier to handle when you think about taking these types of issues incrementally, but making sure that we construct a framework that's open to evolution and open to adapting our own practices as we get more information, as we evaluate the programs or efforts that we're doing, and as the needs for Massachusetts changes and evolves as well. So, I guess other comments or questions?
Yeah, I had a question about the evaluation, which of course we intend to do, but that's easier said than done because you really need the metrics, or what is the system in place, and that seems, why is that lacking elsewhere? Measures are tried, but then they're not evaluated, so we don't know if they're effective. Is that just people don't often think to put the evaluation piece in, or is that just
I think there's two, okay, now, call me a cynic, but I think there's a couple reasons. The first one is that it costs money to do this. And a lot of times the states don't want to allocate the money. They have other uses for it, and they don't see this as all that necessary. And the second piece would be that sometimes we don't know what the answer is. So we may not.
You don't want to know.
Right, so we may not ask for evaluation of something that if it turns out to not be what we're hoping, then we've got to actually do something about it. So that would be the two reasons I would say.
It reminds me, my background is public safety policing, it reminds me of the DARE program. Every police department, we taught all these kids for years and years and years. And there were, it looked good, the lesson plan looked good, the program, the buy-in, but there was no ability to evaluate. That wasn't built in at the beginning. So at the end, there was really no way to know how effective it was.
But I think that there are models that you can follow. I think that SAMHSA, for example, has, very strict reporting requirements for the people who get their funding. And if the state considered adopting something like that, something systematic, where all of the intervention programs and educational programs and prevention programs, had to comply with some type of a reporting system, then there could be independent evaluation, there could be self-evaluation, and then there could be modification over time.
And I think the transparency piece that Rachel talked about a lot is so crucial to that because, again, you should have been able to learn from everybody else's experiences over the last 30 years of this stuff, and you haven't because if it even has been looked at, it's not been, it's all this great literature somewhere out there. And I think there's so much you can do to help, not just yourselves, but everyone else figure out some of these questions that frankly we should have solved a long time ago that we haven't yet.
Are we going to get the benefit of all these slide presentations that were made?
Yes,
Okay.
as long as our presenters are willing to give those to us, we will pull it together and we will post it on our website. And I think Marlene said that she would also be able to post it on the Mass Council website as well. And this certainly is information that will be taken and woven into our efforts moving forward.
That's great, because I'm still hung up in the same place that I was this morning. and not, I mean, I'm not hung up there. But in evaluating the efficacy of a regulatory regime, it seems to me you have to have a pretty good idea of where you want that regulatory regime to wind up at what cost. To give an example, we could do a whole series of regulations, I'm sure, for slot machines that might have unintended consequences, but would stop everybody, I'll make this wildly irrational just to make the point, stop everybody every 10 minutes so that we reinforce the fact that this is potentially a habit-forming device in a bad fashion. So how do you get the how do you devise the set of goals that you want, balancing the needs of the individual patron and the needs of the industry, and the efficacy of what you're trying to do so that you don't create a regime full of unintended consequences. And maybe that's an iterative process, that you build on what exists, you build on what has data, you build on a new thing that seems to work and get data to show you that it does. But it seems to me that as you do that, you have to have a philosophy. And I say that because Dr. Bolberg at the end presented two, it seems to me, very different models at two different ends of the spectrum. One a person-based model, one a operator-based model. And the reality is somewhere in between those. I mean, it's as Dr. Scholl put it, it's the interaction of the man and machine, person and machine, that has to be considered. So that's a windy description of why I still feel that I'm in the woods someplace.
I'll take a whack at that. I mean, I think some of it is, if, as Howard said, if the goal is to reduce incidents or to, you know, to keep the level of gambling problems at where it is now, I mean, you can, there's lots of places you could set that, but working backwards from that, then you hypothesize what are the strategies that you would use to reduce incidents, and it's mainly on the public health side, and then, you know, but that's testable, but it would only be testable over a long period of time. I mean, I think that's the other trap of the you know, not letting the perfect get in the way of the good.
Right.
Yeah, and some of these things are human subjects we're experimenting on in a way, and so some of these you will be incredibly difficult to really truly evaluate some of these because you're not going to have, or I mean, I would defer to the scientists, but I think some of these control groups are going to be really hard to assemble because it's, you know, this is very dangerous behavior that you're looking at. And it's going to be hard to say, okay, we're just going to let this group just go and do it, and then we're going to protect this other group and then see what the real difference between them is. But not to say we shouldn't try, but I think that the horizon too is a long one. That is not, you know, that's going to make that a challenge to get, you know. So this, I think the time frames are really long with some of this stuff. To look at something like incidents, I mean, to really do a good longitudinal study, that's multi-year, right?
Even the problem with that is establishing the causality between new cases
Sure.
and any particular intervention is just really difficult to do.
Yeah.
That's why sort of starting with places that have, you know, is it 2 seconds, is it 3 seconds, is it whatever, and making a decision what you want to do. Do you want to do this, and if so, what time frame or you want to try? You sort of at some point have to take what's already got some empirical evidence and then make a decision based on your options, where you want to come down.
If I can just ask a question here, and you're welcome to answer it, but I really just mean it as a question. There's some underlying premise that seems to be here that we're afraid of the slot machine. It's this mesmerizing event, force. It's going to put people in the zone. It makes them zombies. They're unable to control their actions. And that the result is these massively addicted gamblers. And we have to put in speed bumps, and we have to put in 2-second delays or 4-second delays or timeouts every 50 minutes. And I'd love it if people would step back for a second and think about this question, which is, if this machine is so powerful, and if we've gone from whatever it was in 1985, 30,000 slot machines to now over 900,000 slot machines, and the incidence of pathological and problem gambling is largely the same. If these machines are being designed to create addiction or have the power to create addiction, they're extraordinarily bad at it. They're doing a lousy job.
Well, I use that example just because
I know, but it's in the air. That's all I mean.
It is in the air, and it's in a book, too.
Without data.
No, I hear you, I hear you. But that sort of leads into my point. I mean, how do you know? I mean, and that's much too broad a question. I'm not really that far in the woods. But how do you construct a logical framework for evaluating not only those issues around slot machines, but the other issues around other kinds of things that come up? And how do you respect, as Dr. Schaefer put it this morning, the individual autonomy in the process? I mean, all of those are components of this difficult problem. So how do you do it? One's a highly voluntary program like the AGA advocates. That certainly has been tried, it's been tested, and it needs to be part of the regime. And so I don't have any answers.
Just a couple of thoughts. There have been discussions on how do you approach this dilemma, and a couple come to mind. One is, what are we balancing here? We're balancing personal liberty versus protectionism, and you can actually develop schemes to kind of evaluate where it falls along this continuum of personal liberty versus protectionism from our government. And this has been done a number. I mean, you look at driving, and there's various ways that this dilemma has been approached. And we could take some of these measures and we could kind of plot them on this continuum, and we could decide where they kind of fit. That's only one piece of it. The other piece is, of course, the evaluation. And in Robert Williams' piece that several people have mentioned regarding his review of the prevention evidence, the problem gambling prevention literature, he made a couple of, I think, very compelling conclusions. And one is, it's very difficult to determine on a component basis which of these things are making a difference. He has rated, as Dr. Folberg mentioned, their potential impact. But what we don't know is what is their cumulative impact. So if we took away some that have low impact, is that going to have a bearing on the ultimate impact? And there's going to be, it's going to be a real challenge from an evaluation standpoint to kind of tease apart those, especially, you know, when you come to this cumulative impact. And the other thing that's in that piece of work is, and I believe this comes from Rob Williams, is we need to look at the potentials here. What is the potential for one, revenue loss, one, inconvenience or loss of entertainment, and the potential impact on helping somebody. So for instance, if we put into place a delay or a break that occurs every 5 minutes, where there's this thing that pops up, and there may not be much validity to that, and when you look at the empirical literature, some people say that it's useful, but what's the downside is people may feel a little aggravated, or it doesn't detract that much from the enjoyment. So that's another way to look at it. Is it, if we're positively impacting very few people, one or two, but it could be a very significant impact, versus there's a small annoyance to thousands. You know, where do you draw that line? And these are all things to ponder. I don't think there's any easy answers. In fact, when we talk about the development and rollout of this, and this is in line with what I think Mark is going with this, the first piece is really putting together this framework, and that's the easy piece. We can maybe not reach, or we would never be able to reach probably 100% consensus on this, but in terms of the general principles, in terms of the general strategies, I think most people would be in agreement that these kind of make sense. Now, in terms of what those actually look like in a regulation, where you're drawing the line, that's going to be difficult. And that's where I think what some of our speakers have been saying are probably going to really bear into this, in terms of having to maybe view the first draft as a first and important step in the evolution, but certainly not a final product.
I also think that some of these, even if you look at, take slot machines, I personally don't think that people suggest that slot machines are inherently addictive. I think that there's an interplay that people have noted with regard, just like video games, and there's research on video games and kids. But I think that there's, among the most efficacious strategies, there are ones that are more intrusive and and have more startup time on the part of the operators, and there are some that are less. And so you sort of have to do a cost-benefit analysis on those. Things like slowing down the real spins or putting in time delays, they have to build that potential in, even if you don't start it out in the beginning. So one way of evaluating these things is to take the strategies that you think you might want to implement, and then decide from an industry standpoint what would be entailed and which ones would be a real pain and expense to go back and add. And if you're interested in those, start with those.
Can we throw something out? Because just the concept of drawing a line, I think is important. And we heard a little bit today about self-exclusion, and obviously it came up in the suitability. I just think one of the important issues that we didn't really talk about is that there is still no established duty of care. I mean, when push comes to shove, it is as the attorneys on this panel know, unlike in alcohol, there is no duty of care. And I don't know that Massachusetts would necessarily establish that on a legal basis, but I think until we do, you are going to have this playing field that differs from state to state, from industry to industry, and that by drawing a bright line would be agonizingly hard to draw, and I'm sure that would be a horribly divisive thing. But at some point, without a bright line, nobody really knows where that, what is too much, what is too little. And I do think eventually that might benefit the industry in the short term. And I welcome your input on that, but I know that's naive and Pollyannish, but it seems to me from a policy perspective, if you don't have that, it makes things a little bit more difficult. But that again.
I think we do have a duty of care. It's set out in laws and regulations, which we are held to. I've litigated a bunch of those cases. They're easy cases for the casinos to win, because most judges actually think when you go into a casino and you gamble, you may lose. And they're not surprised that somebody might lose. So, the casino offers its product, which is gambling, and it's approved by the state. So these plaintiffs generally, almost uniformly, fail. Now, sometimes you could have exterior evidence that would make a situation less attractive. Somebody who's self-excluded, somebody who took the application for self-exclusion and sees them there and doesn't say anything. You could have a bad case, and then maybe there would be liability. But I have to say that it seems to me the courts have been doing a fine job with that. I don't think this is something that's crying out for attention. I think you've got some tough issues in front of you, and that's not one of them.
I wanted to throw a question back to the concept of behavioral tracking, and another one of the recommendations that was talked about relative to doing away with the cash rewards or the rewards for the players. And sometimes it occurs to me that the ability of anybody, either the casino or the regulator, to track behavioral data that will inform research is predicated on the fact that people will volunteer information, and the best incentive for them to do that is often offering a bit of a reward. So I just wanted to kind of throw that to the panel, see if I could have some more reaction or dialogue on that. Isn't there a bit of a tension there? If there was no player behavioral data tracking, how can we inform the research that we want to make, holistically?
Are you questioning the ethics of?
No. I'm just the dilemma behind our ability to get information about players, and the best way for anybody to do that is by offering some incentive to sign up into some kind of rewards program.
I guess I could probably comment a little bit on that. The division since 2004 actually has been doing quite a bit with behavioral analytics, but in the online space. What makes that a little bit different is that any of the operators can basically provide you with every single click that an individual makes on their website. So we've had the opportunity to have data sets as large as 47,000 people, that we get, we request it and you get it at the end of the month. And for all the social scientists, on the panel, that's nothing short of kind of amazing to be able to have access to something like that. And you see everything that they do. You see every deposit, every withdrawal, every, switching from game to game, every wager, every outcome, the amount of time that they're on, the amount of time that they're subscribing. You don't see them switching from provider to provider necessarily, and so you can't track their entire gambling ecology, but you can understand exactly what they're doing on the provider that you're working with. I think that one of the major differences between that work and the land-based work is exactly what you're identifying, is that the people who would be contributing to the information that you could get from behavioral analytics and the land-based providers, are opting in. So you're not necessarily going to get a complete picture of what everyone is doing. And the people who are opting in might be opting in selectively. So it kind of, the quality of the data that's available, I think, is going to be quite different from what you would find in online space. And that's going to pose a whole bunch of challenges to figuring out whether or not that data, figuring out the value of that data. Not that it's not going to have some, but I think it's going to be more difficult to get a complete understanding of just what you can get from it.
Yeah, the only way to really do that is what Missouri had at the beginning, which is an ID system, where when you come in, you have to use an ID, you have to use an ID for everything so that it's tracked very similarly. But that's not a popular, it's not really what most places are doing.
You're still not going to get information across to the operator.
Right, unless they're owned by the same company. Yeah.
Because you may have card swapping.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I mean, payments may provide some of that, there may be ways to get at that, but yeah, I think it's absolutely true that it's
But having said that, if you require certain data, and I mean, this is not going to be a popular thing to say, but there are, having been at G2E many years, there's wonderful marketing programs that operators use that track a lot of really important variables for marketing purposes, that if a state were to mandate that those same tracking, even using an altered version of that software, were required for tracking player data and then turned over for analysis, that could be really rich data, definitely not the same as knowing every click, but it really could provide something, but states haven't gone that far.
My guess is that they would build on something like that because it would be kind of a cost-effective way of kind of
Right.
achieving the tracking that you would need. But think about all the junk mail that you get from the marketers, and you wonder, like, why did I get, I don't own a dog, why am I getting, mail for pet insurance, and, something happened in the marketing. And then there are algorithms that they're creating based on, my shopping patterns at Market Basket or whatever.
I had a question, and David is directed to you in reviewing the AGA's code of conduct, and it'd be great, it would save us a lot of regulatory nightmares if we knew every applicant was subscribing to what you require of your members. But one of the bullets talks about AGA members where permitted by law would make available to the patrons, explaining the possibilities of winning and losing. Why the requirement or kind of waiting to be allowed by law to make that information available?
I have to plead passage of time to some extent. That was composed more than 10 years ago, but I believe it is based on the concern that there are regulations that require the exact way in which odds can be disclosed. In some states, it has to be a book that's kept at a particular place in the casino, and it has every game and every iteration. It's really thick and it's hard to read. It's not the best way to get the news to the players, and we're not crazy about it, but if that's the only way we're allowed to do it in that jurisdiction, we may not be able to give them the pamphlet we would rather give them. So I think that's the constraint there. I think you can work around that.
Okay.
Just as an aside, I also think it might be worthwhile having some conversations with Norse Tipping. Are some people who are regulators in countries that require an enormous amount of tracking, just to figure out, what they're doing and see if there's anything that informs. I think I gave you all the Norse Tipping documents, I think, right? I mean, that's an extreme form of tracking, but at least it gives you a sense about what can be done, what is being done, and then you can figure out what you personally think is reasonable.
I was also going to make an analogy to, we're going through policy thinking on another field that I think dovetails into this discussion, one of internal controls. And we've looked at other jurisdictions that have been very prescriptive in terms of what they need to do to protect assets. And then another approach that is very much a goals-based or even a risk management approach. Set the goals, set the principles, set the guidelines, and let the operator say, respond to those goals. Is there a parallel here? Did I hear from some of the examples today when you establish a mandatory pre-commitment, say, that may be too much on the prescriptive side, and it has these unintended consequences. People pre-commit to something that they weren't going to begin with. Whereas if you are more along the in the spectrum towards a risk mitigation or a goal-setting principles, we would be ultimately at a better outcome. Is that a fair statement? Can I get some reaction from some of you?
I can take a little bit of a stab on that. It's thinking about Kansas, and and also New Mexico does this, where they ask their operators to submit a responsible gambling plan, and they also provide some minimum requirements as to what goes in that plan. And the downside to that approach is you don't have uniformity across the properties. Some will go beyond the minimum, and some will meet the minimum. They're all very good at complying with what they need to comply with. I'm speaking with regulators in those jurisdictions. So that's the downside is you may have some inconsistency between the different operators by taking that approach, and you may hope for more than the minimum, but you may not get it.
All right, thank you.
I had a question. I think, Dr. LaPlante, you were talking about employment, and as we partner with our community colleges to do a lot of screening up front of potential people to enter this industry, how can we discern whether somebody is going into this business for all the wrong reasons and just can't wait to hang out in a casino and misbehave, so to speak? Short of just asking them and hoping we get an honest reply. But, you know, what is the industry doing about that? What as regulators could we possibly do to help make sure that, I mean, if it's an area where people can get tripped up and develop bad habits, we want to try to avoid that.
You know, I think that's a really great question, and I'm not really sure what the industry is doing about it. I'm sure that they're hiring. Well, I don't know. I would think that they potentially would want their hiring practices to try to make sure that people are trying to work at the casinos or wherever for the right reasons. I think some people probably, you know, get through the cracks. That's why we see these disoriented people. And there might even be people there for the wrong reasons, you know, in the other knowledge groups as well. As far as what specifically can you do, I don't know that I have the answer to that right now. What would I prescribe? I would think that it might be important for a new employee orientation, you know, to do something like some type of a pre-survey, that you could try to find a little bit more information about where people are at the particular moment. And, you know, you could track them into different types of training. Maybe there's a standard training, maybe there's an expert level training, maybe there's a specially designed training for people who seem like they might be headed on the wrong path. And I would start with some type of a pre-screen to see whether or not that would be something that would be, you know, workable. And it doesn't seem like it would require too much, you know, something that you could do, you know, right at the start of an orientation. Doesn't need to be something that's overly elaborate, I wouldn't think. But.
Well, we have reached the end of our time. I just want to thank each and every person who came to join this panel. You were an amazing group of experts, and you were each invited for your very specific skills and knowledge in this area. I think that today we had a range of persons and who they represent and maybe where their orientation is, and I think that some of that came out today. And I think that's great, and it's good to hear a wide range of voices, and I think it's really important for our commissioners to hear that as well. Where we end up lying, where our framework goes, will certainly be influenced by the discussion that happened today. So please know that the time and effort that you came to prepare for this has not gone to waste, but it certainly is. It's a timely discussion for the Commission. It's a timely discussion for Massachusetts, and I think it's been overall just a fantastic day. So thank you, and thank you to the Commissioners for your continued interest and commitment in this area. I came to work for the Commission for some very specific reasons, and this was top of my list for a group of very invested. You're very invested in these issues, and it's just an honor to be aligned with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks for pulling the
Thank
panel
you.
together.
Thank
You guys got very lucky to steal him from Iowa.
We know we did.
We know we did, yeah. Thank you all very much. That was